Well, good afternoon from London, everybody, and thank you for joining Mod Gothic, Medieval Architecture in the Modern Ages. My name is Tom Nickson, and I'm one of the organisers of this conference. And as Senior Lecturer in Medieval Art and Architecture at the Courtauld, I face the often daunting prospect of following in the footsteps of Peter Kidson and Paul Crossley, to whom this conference pays tribute. It's a really enormous pleasure to see that we're joined today by so many people from around the world. A real mixture of distinguished scholars, students, old friends, and those joining one of these events for the very first time. You're all very welcome. And over the next 2 days, we can look forward, I think, to a mixture of fascinating historiography, personal reminiscences, and I suspect some revealing and occasionally very funny photographs as well, I think. I'm going to be chairing the papers and discussions for the next 2 days, but for now, it's my pleasure to pass over to Deborah Swallow, Director of the Courtauld, who's going to say a few words of welcome and introduction. So over to you, Debbie.
Thank you, Tom, and a very warm welcome from me. A welcome to the virtual Courtauld, but in fact, I'm actually sitting in Somerset House myself in the physical Courtauld, so it's a welcome from both the physical and the virtual. It's a huge pleasure to start the proceedings of this conference in tribute to the extraordinary scholarship and teaching of Peter Kidson and Paul Crossley. In early 2019, when Peter Kidson, PK, died, we all agreed that the most appropriate way to pay him immediate tribute was to republish the words used by Paul Crossley and Eric Fernie for his retirement festschrift. None of us could have realized that in December that year, we would also lose Paul. When that sadly happened, we soon agreed that the best way for us to honor both of these distinguished academics and much loved colleagues, who were themselves so close and gave so much to the Courtauld, was to host an event for them together. Plans were laid for this conference to take place last academic year, but given COVID, we initially deferred the date to October 2020 in that vain, as it turned out, hope that the pandemic would be controlled and we'd be all back to normal by the autumn. And then, with the ongoing challenges of the pandemic, deferred it to this year, hoping that by delaying, we might all be able to meet in person. But with extended lockdowns and restrictions on travel, we had to decide to host the event eventually online and take advantage of this to ensure a breadth of participation from speakers and audience internationally. So while we regret this in some ways, we're really pleased that people from all over the country and around the world are with us today. Many people here will be familiar with PK's and Paul's biographies, and each speaker will be adding elements of reference to these and personal recollection. But I'll just give some very brief headlines and then add my own personal recollections of these two extraordinary men. Peter Kidson was born appropriately almost in the shadow of York Minster in 1925. Clearly a brilliant student and scholar from the first, his education was disrupted by naval service in the Second World War, after which he went up to Cambridge and read history and moral sciences before heading to the Courtauld, where amazingly he remained for the whole of the rest of his career until his retirement. Taught initially by Johannes Wilder, it was his tutor, Christopher Holer, who first kindled his interest in Gothic proportion. And as those of you who know Christopher Holer or knew him will know, introduced him also to the, as is said in the obituary, the values of erudite irreverence. Peter wrote his doctorate on systems of measurement and proportion in early medieval architecture under Geoffrey Webb. Over the next decade or so, key publications followed: Sculpture at Chartres, The History of English Architecture, and Medieval World. In 1955, Peter had already joined the staff of the Courtauld's Conway Library under George Zarnetsky, another great medievalist. In 1959, he became the Conway librarian. In 1967, a full lecturer, in 1971, reader, and in 1988, professor. A career which, it said, during which virtually single-handedly, he took the study of medieval architecture in this country onto a new level of intellectual sophistication, becoming arguably the most influential historian of medieval architecture of his generation in the English-speaking world. Others will speak more about Piquet's teaching and scholarship and their own relationships with him. I would just like to share some recollections. When I first joined the Courtauld in 2004, following a distinguished line of scholar directors, many of them medievalists, there was inevitable curiosity and most likely skepticism about what someone with a background in literature, anthropology, and South Asia would or could bring to the Courtauld. And I'm sure that Peter rightly shared this view. I was fully aware of his intellectual standing and of course was already dependent on his short history of the Courtauld as my handbook for understanding the Institute. But what struck me most when I first met him was his inherent modesty, behind which rapidly I realized sat sharp, indeed acute intelligence, a real charm, and a deep commitment to the Institute. He was clearly assessing me, but never revealed his real views and was always tremendously supportive. He continued to come to Courtauld throughout his life until it was impossible for academic events, and particularly enjoyed an annual Christmas lunch we give, barring pandemics, for honorary fellows and emeriti. He was always early to arrive and late to leave these gatherings of old friends and colleagues, along with new faculty and curators who would share memories of the past and activities and news of the present. Another of my strongest memories is a memorable day when Eric Fernie, Paul, and I visited Peter and his wife Sarah at their lovely home, had a wonderful lunch and discussed the world, and of course the Courtauld, and then sat down in the afternoon to listen to a recording of Anthony Blunt giving an autobiographical lecture from late in his time in the Courtauld. This was the first time I had heard Blunt's voice. Otherwise, the most fascinating thing about the lecture was, of course, its omissions. So for Eric, Peter, and Paul, it brought back vivid memories and evoked strong passions. The discussion which followed significantly enriched my understanding of this early history of the Courtauld, as you might imagine. I did, of course, have more day-to-day contact with Paul Crossley, as our time as colleagues at the Courtauld overlapped happily for a period of 7 years, and Paul was much closer to me generationally, and as with Peter, we shared a Cambridge connection. Paul, too, had been a brilliant student and linguist, and his speaking skills were reflected in, and no doubt honed by, his role as president of the Cambridge Union. He studied law and indeed could clearly have been a great barrister, but instead, perhaps fulfilling a deeper dimension of his personality, moved to history of art, still a minor subject then at Cambridge. So his PhD on Gothic art in Lesser Poland led to co-supervision from Peter Kidson at the Courtauld and much support from George Zarnetzi. Then, after teaching at Manchester through the 1970s and 80s, it was happy circumstance that brought Paul to join the Courtauld's faculty in 1990, where he remained as professor until 2011. Again, others will speak about the many facets of Paul's brilliant academic career and writing, his wit and humour, and great generosity of spirit. For me, Paul was a colleague whose arrival in the room brought a smile to my face, and to everyone's. How can I or any of you forget the wonderful way in which he would say your name? And for those minutes, not just a moment, for those minutes when you met, you were the most important person in the world, the focus of his attention and the recipient of his genuine interest, care, concern, and I believe affection. Paul was not an administrator, of course, and not one for forms and processes, he got to the essence of things. So as his manager, as you can imagine, if I can call it manager, it was quite difficult to carry out annual appraisals, certainly with deep managerial seriousness. I can't recall him ever quite getting the form filling or indeed the forms themselves quite right. And though we would actually have a wonderful conversation about the substance of his work, he would often, who knows, perhaps intentionally, manage to turn the tables and inquire with genuine interest how I was doing, deflecting discussion from himself until suddenly another knock on the door brought the session to an end. But on several occasions, we discussed the possibility of co-teaching a comparative course on the Gothic cathedral and the medieval Hindu temple. I much regret that, and I should say, and also modern Hindu temple, I much regret that it never came to pass, and even now fantasize on the thought of what it would have been like to do that with him, to take groups of students and other faculty on the ultimate study trip from Ely in East Anglia to Bhubaneswar, Puri and Konark in Eastern India. Sadly, the last time I met Paul was at Peter's funeral in early 2019. The double association makes this conference in their combined honour personally yet more fitting. This gathering of such distinguished speakers and the fact that many of those attending the conference are their former colleagues and students are tributes to the high regard and affection in which both Paul and PK were held. We're especially delighted that Peter's widow, Sarah Pearson, is joining us and will tell us about his book project later in the conference. But from me, I'd just like to thank you all so much for joining us. I'd also like to thank Acacia Finbow and the Research Forum team who have done so much to help set up the event, and to our development and alumni team for spreading the word to ensure that as many people were aware of it as possible around the world. Finally, I'm delighted to hand back to Tom, to whom we all owe a huge debt for organising the conference, to take the proceedings forward and start the discussion of Paul's own question. Each age builds its own Gothic cathedral. What did the modern ages make of the Middle Ages? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Debbie. At the end, I will add a few of my own remarks in a similar light. But for now, just before I introduce the first speaker, I just wanted to explain a little bit about the format for the conference, which is the same for both today and tomorrow, where we'll have pairs of papers, each generally of 30 minutes, and followed by discussion and then a break of 10 to 15 minutes. It will only be possible to see and hear the speakers as well as myself, but I warmly encourage you to put any questions or contributions into the chat function at the bottom of your screens. And I'll do my best to read them out in the discussion sessions. And I know that there are a lot of people who will have memories and also insights into many of the things that we're discussing over the next 2 days. So I'm really hopeful that we can get a kind of lively discussion going, even though it probably goes without saying that PK and certainly Paul would have absolutely loathed this kind of virtual world we're all inhabiting now. But as Debbie said, we can at least join together from all over the world for this event. So as Debbie has hinted at, our speakers over the next 2 days include some of the leading scholars and teachers of their generation. And that, I think, is a tribute to the esteem and affection with which Peter Kidson and Paul Crossley are remembered. Some of you will also recall, though, that Paul could on occasion give speakers introductions that were so extraordinarily generous and so eloquent that the lectures themselves could only come as a disappointment by contrast. And so to avoid this and to save everyone from a kind of competitive surfeit of superlatives, I've agreed with the speakers that I'm only going to very, very briefly introduce them. And I've asked that instead of me listing their publications and many accolades, that instead they say a few words about their first encounters with Paul and with PK. So let's begin. And our first speaker today is Elizabeth Sears, who is George H. Forsyth Junior Collegiate Professor of History of Art at the University of Michigan. 3 years ago, Betsy gave a revelatory series of lectures on the implicated and complementary histories of the Warburg and Courtauld Institutes. And today she will speak on Panofsky on the Gothic style, new texts. Over to you, Betsy.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm so delighted to be here, honored to have been asked, and I'm much looking forward to the whole array of papers. So to start with Reminiscence, I'm sure I know Peter Kidson and Paul Crossley. I knew them far less well than many at this conference, but I did intersect at some interesting historical junctures, I'll say. When I was in London in the late 70s, conducting dissertation research at the Warburg Institute, I, of course, regularly attended the Courtauld Medieval Works in Progress seminars. And this was really a privilege because this was when the Gang of Four was in action. So to hear Żarnecki, Lasko, Holler, and Kitson go at it was something to remember. I also participated in one of those Robertson Courtauld excursions, and this one to Andalusia, and that was led by Peter Kidson, along with Julian Gardner and Anthony Blunt, just before he was exposed as a Soviet spy in the Thatcher era. Paul Crossley, I remember first trying to hear him speak, and that was on the German Gothic at the famous SIHA conference that took place in Berlin just after the fall of the wall. But at that point, I was turned away at the door because the room was so packed, which I suppose is a tribute to him. Later, of course, we met, and I did get to hear him speak memorably, most recently on Doctus at one of the events on the rhetorical arts organized by Mary Carruthers. And of course, Kitson on Sujet and Crossley on the iconography of architecture were part of my reading list. And this provides the segue to my paper, which treats a towering figure in the field, Erwin Panofsky, whose publications on Gothic architecture presented a standing challenge, or maybe it would be better to say a source of stimulating irritation to both Kitson and Crossley. My purpose today is to present a sizable cache of unknown, unpublished materials by Panofsky dealing with the Gothic style. The texts in question are 3 lectures that Panofsky delivered at the University of Virginia in 1942, as well as a fragment of the book that was to follow. This book, to be titled The Gothic Style, was on contract with Princeton University Press. The manuscript was to be delivered in December 1943, which never happened. The unpublished texts are now housed at the Leo Baeck Institute in New York, deposited there by Panofsky's widow, still alive, Gerda Panofsky. Access is restricted, so I am grateful to her for allowing me to work with the materials and to prepare the texts for publication. Paul Binsky is going to help me with that. The texts, I believe, give us means for looking afresh at the 3 classic studies Panofsky did publish in the succeeding decade: Sujet, Gothic architecture and scholasticism, and early Netherlandish painting. These more focused studies can be rightly regarded as spin-offs from, developments of, the more broadly based project he had embarked on shortly before. The unfinished book, The Gothic Style, reveals itself to be a kind of ghostly undergirding for the rest. So to start, here's the announcement for the lectures, a named series, the Page Barber Lectures, which have been going at UVA since 1907. Panofsky had initially wanted to give 4 lectures so as to divide his material more effectively, but the organizer, and we see his name below, Acheson Hench, is a professor of English, said that the mixed audience, academic and non-academic, would likely not be comfortable with more than 3. Panofsky adopted a strictly chronological approach. This makes sense since periodization was going to be a key outcome. His tactic was to embark on sustained analysis of the formal structures of works of architecture, sculpture, and painting. His effort was to define what he called Gothic logic, to bring out essential features of the style, and to make sense of the rapid changes and developments within it. I myself became involved in this whole project in a most roundabout manner, and a recounting of my own archival adventures and misadventures is perhaps the most expeditious way of introducing you to what survives. For me, it all started here with the book proposal. It was a few years back, I think it was 2017. I was at Princeton for a conference. I had a free afternoon. So I was going through some folders from the archives of the Princeton University Press, Panofsky among them. And so I was reading through, and it was mostly about the book Albrecht Dürer. And then suddenly I came upon this page, and it was a book proposal for, of course, the Gothic style. And I was surprised because I knew Panofsky had not published a book on the Gothic style. And I read through. It was a standard kind of proposal. First, you say what it's supposed to be, who the audience is. And so he said, this book will not be a detailed study, which may be of interest to scholars only, but a presentation of such basic characteristics, morphological and otherwise, as seem significant to the author and may be of interest to any educated reader. So that was the audience. And always in these things, you have to situate it, talk about possible readership and purpose. And he said that it would fill a gap in the English literature. And sort of surprisingly to me, he drew a comparison to a book just out. As it happens, it may serve as a kind of supplement to the remarkable recent book by Mr. Morey, Medieval Art, 1942, for while dealing with the Gothic style in a manner hard to approach, impossible to surpass within the framework defined by Mr. Morey, his book yet leaves room for a discussion of precisely those aspects in which this writer is particularly interested in. Now, Morey's book on medieval art is a forgotten work, to be sure, but it had just come out. Certainly Morey was a colleague and a friend of Panofsky. And as chair of the Department of Art and Archaeology right there at Princeton University, Panofsky at the Institute for Advanced Study, of course. In 1943, it was revered and clearly had to be taken into account. And I think Panofsky did read it carefully, as we'll see. So the proposal was my starting point. Of course, I came upon it just as the library was about to close. I snapped this picture and made note to self to return at some point and read through the rest of the file. A year later, I did so and I got hooked. So I proceeded to gather all the relevant correspondence I could from the University of Virginia archives, the Archives of American Art, which supplemented the letters published in Wutke's huge edition of Panofsky correspondence. This was the first point at which I thought I had everything relevant. And then just to check, I got in touch with Gerda Panofsky to be absolutely sure that the lectures themselves did not survive somewhere I couldn't find. And she said, oh yes, they do survive in part, but they are not in the public domain until 2038. And this was a very great downer at the time. But we had an exchange and she then gave me access most generously. And so I went to the Leo Baeck Institute and called up the papers and I got the folder on the Gothic style. And to my surprise, I found it was not the lectures, but the first 17 pages of the book manuscript. So I took photographs and I transcribed it, contained a nice kind of punchy brief history of the perception of Gothic. And then a few pages of the first chapter, the antecedents of Gothic. So now I assumed I had it all and I prepared a lecture. I was going to go to Munich a couple of weeks hence when I carefully reread a long email from Gerda Panofsky, my bad, in which she said there were two files. Now this was worrying since the lecture was about to happen. So I called the Leo Baeck Institute immediately, and a really accommodating archivist went and searched out the second folder and had the scanning people do a rapid scan. And in 5 days, I had a big pile of about, I think it was 113 pages of handwritten text. The archivist said, this will take you months. I had a week and I did it in a week. I'm really rather proud of that. And this is what one's up against when I'm reading Panofsky text. Like anyone, he amends, he inserts, but his particular thing is to write something out and then to want to rewrite it. And then he writes the new paragraph on another piece of paper, clips it out and pastes it on. And of course, I think he used rubber cement. So it's all these globs and dribbles all over the place. And he inserts things. He always uses this little Greek symbol here. Whoops. He uses this, the Greek symbol that you see on the top to insert a thing. So it was heavy going, I'd say, because whenever he got really thinking quickly, he would just scribble. And unlike a Gothic scribe who abbreviates a great deal, Panofsky just contracts willfully by leaving out letters. And so it can be quite the challenge at times. Here are a few examples. On the top, you see one of his ways of writing the word that. And then you look down at the next, which is contrast, and the next, which is arcades, and the next, which is altarpieces. And you see, you really do have to have a decoder ring in order to get to it. It was very clear that these were the actual lectures, and it seems he would have brought them quasi-memorized into the room with him. Slides are indicated by circles. Here we have one with an ID, map of France, and all the way through their oral locutions. On the screen you see, so this is presented. The good thing is that Panofsky numbered them all the way through consecutively. So you know that they are almost completely extant. A couple of pages missing from the first lecture, one from the second lecture, and we'll get to this at the very end. It's defective. I think he took a bunch of papers and used them elsewhere for other lectures, and they just didn't get back here, because we'll see he did plunder these and gave lectures elsewhere on the same topic. Okay, so again, I thought I had everything. But then I was on fellowship. This was the pre-COVID year in New York City. And so I had an opportunity to go through the boxes of Panofsky papers systematically, many interesting things, I'll tell you. And then I came upon one file, a folder labeled undated, unidentified lecture notes. It contained a stack of pages, and the first page was page 18. I told you the other file contained 1 to 17, so immediately I knew that this was more of the book manuscript. Panofsky, it turns out, had written over 30,000 words of the book, the introduction, and the greater part of chapter 1, the antecedents of the Gothic style. Its war era date is confirmed by some of the cannibalized pieces of paper he used for his paste-ins, like this one. You undoubtedly know that Mr. Owen is in the Navy. So putting it right in the 1940s, as one would expect. These are the headings of the typescript of the Gothic style. So mass and structure, as we'll see, that's very important. And then he goes on to Greek, Roman, Oriental hinterland, which Krautheimer had found so interesting, and others, Vygotsky, proto-medieval, insular, Ottonian Romanesque. So what we really have is the closest thing to Panofsky writing an American style survey. Maury's medieval art provided model and anti-model. And we read what he thought about everything from Hagia Sophia to the Book of Kells. So for Panofskyites, it will be of interest to have this available. So I really do think now I have everything, except that I've not yet tackled this potential source. At the same time he was giving the lectures, probably in preparation for them, he gave a course at NYU at the Institute on the Gothic style. There's his bibliography, and there's a whole ream of very, 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 very messy pages that I'm going to have to come to terms with, I suppose, before this project is at an end. Right, so I imagine that we would, all of us, have a different takeaway from reading this new Panofsky material. What has come to interest me most, I would say, is how the Gothic served Panofsky across his career in Germany and in the US as he developed method. Why Gothic? What did its study enable him to do? What experiments, as it were, was he able to run with it? And there are some clues. Immediately upon receiving the invitation from Professor Hensch at UVA, almost by return of post, he said, sure, he would speak, and he gave 3 topics. He could speak on the Gothic style, Baroque art in Italy, or the international style, about 1400. Hensch said, you choose, and he said, then I'll choose Gothic style. It might be the most attractive from the point of view of giving an impression of a great movement in European art and of art historical method in general. He was always both performing method and doing historical work. The Gothic was a test case. For him, it was crucial that it could be regarded as a new style, susceptible to interpretation as such. I think for him, this gave a certain control on analysis. And if one looks through his writings, you find that he often would focus on firsts. Early on in lecture 1, and of course, he's always speaking about the West, it's about Europe, that's his purview. Gothic, he said, is the only great and universal style created outside of the orbit of Mediterranean civilization, a style in which the Northwest of Europe emancipated itself from the South and once and for all severed its stylistic relationship with the East. Big statement. To define the governing principles of Gothic and to demarcate its phases and variants, Panofsky set up an extensive series of antitheses. This is also very typical Panofsky. He rooted his architectural analyses in the fundamental analysis, the fundamental elements of mass and structure. And he proceeded in a big sweep through Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Greek, Roman. He said that the task of the Middle Ages, in his view, was to integrate mass and structure. His definition of the Gothic hinged in good part on the contrast with the Romanesque, common strategy, of course. He put it this way: if Romanesque was mass articulated, it had a contradiction at its heart. Mass is by definition continuous, and articulation presupposes parts. Miraculously, Gothic solved the conflict. Panofsky wrote, so pervasive is the tendency to combine complete articulation with perfect continuity that it accounts for the smallest detail in Gothic architecture. His premise, as I say, which he seeks to substantiate, is that Gothic represented a new style. There was no transition to it, strictly speaking. Drawing an extended biological metaphor, he said, a child has parents, but the parents are not a transition to the child. He grows older, however, and of this postnatal development, it may be said that a transition takes place from childhood to adolescence, from adolescence to maturity, and so forth. Likewise, the Gothic style had antecedents in the various Romanesque schools, and it had a postnatal development. On the screen, you see his schema of the postnatal development. He constructed 5 phases. And these held good, as he believed, in what he called the 120 miles zone around Paris. It became the 100-mile zone in Gothic architecture and scholasticism. And in the first lecture, we see him doing very intense visual analytical work to come to this point. These are the demarcations on which he would base the parallels he drew in Gothic architecture and scholasticism. Gothic, in his view, was first a regional style, that is, created in this 120-mile zone around Paris, and it became a universal style. And he tries to draw larger conclusions from this. He says it's not unlike ancient Greece, the same thing happened there, and but very much unlike what happened in Romanesque, a different pattern. It was within this zone, the 120-mile zone, that there could be and was standardization, the Gothic system, the Gothic capital, the Gothic program of decoration. And this meant both perfection and impoverishment. One can see it was with pleasure that Panofsky in the succeeding lectures went on to analyze the wild variations of Gothic form elsewhere in Europe. In that first lecture, he traced a development beginning, of course, with Saint-Denis, but he treated first the phenomenon of the Gothic within the interior and then Gothic on facades. And the culmination of the latter he found in Saint-Nicaise, known only through engravings. He called it the Parthenon of the Gothic, of course, pleasing his audience. The lost church, destroyed in the 19th century, he regarded as the perfect fulfillment of the Gothic ideal, radically structural. His architect was Hugues Bergier, representative of the new class of professional architect. And I thought maybe a little sample of his analytical prose, his dissection of pure form would be appropriate. The discussion is like that in Gothic architecture and scholasticism, but it's filled out. It took a genius to hit upon a solution so obvious that it escaped the attention of a whole century. He built the rose into an enormous window. This had the advantage that the space beneath it was perfectly filled and organized, and moreover, that here, for the first time, the facade was a completely congruent projection of the interior. The cross-section of the central nave is directly represented by the big window. The cross-sections of the aisles are similarly represented by smaller windows, above which two transparent towers, not even glazed, open up the view of the flying buttresses, which since Chartres had been treated as both a functional and a decorative device. Now I'll move a little more quickly to finish up. In lecture 2, Panofsky built upon the results of the first as he turned to contemporary sculpture and painting. How, he asked, did the style of all of these sculptures reflect the basic stage which could be observed in architecture? In what sense, in other words, can the name Gothic, originally, after all, an architectural term, be applied to the plastic arts? Began with architectural sculpture, emphasizing, as he put it, that Gothic sculpture is not, as is frequently said, subservient to architecture, but both are the two aspects of the same phenomenon. Using the Chartres gem figures as a prime example, he went from very early Gothic with its still floating figures to mature early Gothic, and key was the establishment of the principle of axiality, the nucleus for the rest. Soon in early High Gothic, sculptors had come to the point where they were ready to admit the influence of classical models. And even if local and short-lived, this was crucial to later developments. As in architecture, so in sculpture, in mature High Gothic, there can be seen an analogous balance in articulation and continuity. Golden Virgin of Amiens, which he dated to 1260-70, shows a swing that is classical contrapposto in disguise. And then comes late Gothic, the dematerialization, the disappearance of contrapposto. As in architecture, quote, the evolution swerved toward continuity at the expense of articulation. Turn to painting, focusing on developments in pictorial space, concluding that its evolution was similar in structure, but on a different timeline. Painting was first behind, then synchronized with, and later ahead of sculpture. And at the end of lecture 2, he turned to the period late Gothic in all media, period when Gothic went everywhere and the Ile-de-France became provincial. The final lecture, lecture 3, allowed him to focus on the rise and efflorescence of naturalism. It's interesting to watch Panofsky begin with the Arnolfini portrait on which it published. He cannot but introduce iconographical considerations, the disguised symbolism in everyday objects, candle dog shoes, etc. But again, relentlessly, he returned to form, to the placement of persons and objects within the pictorial space, to the suggestion of infinite space. Then, adopting a tactic he would use in the book Early Netherlandish Painting, he moved back in time and charted the rise in spatial representation up to and including the still mysterious international style, which fascinated him. Only at the very conclusion of the lecture, and this is the last page, did Panofsky proceed to what we might consider the payoff. Only then did he begin to align form with the world of the spirit, to look for those habits of mind informing cultural production. He decided to present a series of sculpted faces, representative of different phases of the Gothic, and to correlate these with developing thoughts on the relation of soul and body, saying that the interpretation of the human face is always a surer index of what is called the spirit of a period than anything else. And there's a brief hint of this tactic in Gothic architecture and scholasticism. I mentioned that the ending of lecture 3 is defective. I think on the very top of this page, I can make out the word Abelard. I think that was where he was going. But it was unfinished. And I think that's because at this point, he gave the first version of what would become the published lecture on Gothic architecture and scholasticism. And there are several indications. He also was giving other lectures. He was very much on the lecture circuit. Everybody wanted him to speak. And so here's a lecture series he gave in '44 at the Morgan Library. And you see some of the themes I've brought out are those that would have been highlighted in the book to come. What do we mean by the term Gothic when applied outside of architecture and so on, and a lecture, Gothic Art and Scholasticism. And here also Vassar College, Krautheimer, his friend, and Katzenelnbogen, the student, taught there. He got lots of invitations. So he gave many of these lectures there, first calling it Scholasticism and Gothic, then Gothic Art and Architecture and Scholasticism. So he was developing these things. They would have been put in the book, but no. And then when at St. Vincent's Arch Abbey at La Trobe, Benedictine Abbey, when he was asked to deliver the Wimmer lecture, he wrote this, that he'd really like to present a lecture to them, and he thought Gothic architecture and scholasticism would be it. The only difficulty is that, as he said, I have undertaken to write a little book on the Gothic style in general, which will, however, not appear for 2 or 3 years. And in this, I should have to repeat more or less the contents of the proposed lecture. And the Wimmer people said, fine. And so he published that single lecture, which was, as it were, pulled out of the whole book on Gothic. So now I'm just going to end here by saying that I will at one point be looking more at the, as I say, at the arc of Panofsky's work in relation to the Gothic. And this will all start with his study in Berlin, but particularly in Freiburg with Ferge, with whom he took a course on the Gothic. And of course, for Ferge, Chartres always represented not the end of Romanesque, but the beginning of something new, a new style with new principles. Panofsky first traveled to Chartres in '25. He might have acquired this picture there. This is from a little travel notebook that were quite interesting, that is in the LBI, where he's at Chartres on site, making all these little sketches. And he wrote to Dora at the time, if one does not know this cathedral, one shouldn't even speak about sculpture and architecture. Problems of style always interested him. He wrote his book, of course, on Gothic sculpture of 24. I find this one really interesting, a review of Rosenthal on Giotto, where he really criticizes this man for creating the wrong kind of higher level parallelisms. 27, of course, brings his work on the Four Masters at Reims Cathedral, which is right behind this work, same kind of formal analysis, and where he gets to issues of historical time and stylistic synchronicity. And very important, I think, was the first page of Giorgio Vasari's Libro, because this is when he begins to talk about periodization, the recognition of periods as something distinct, as totalities. So it's inadequate to call Panofsky an iconographer or an iconologist tout court, though many have. In 1941, he said he was among those who, quote, have tried to bring about a reintegration of formal analysis and iconography with a certain amount of connoisseurship as an indispensable prerequisite. Always he was aiming at synthesis. So his little book on the Gothic style didn't get done. I'll show you a couple of funny letters as I close. Dr. Smith, director of the press, wrote in 44, I have no thought of pressing you for the manuscript of the Gothic style, but I did want you to know that we should be glad to have it whenever you're able to give it to us, and that you should not hold back under the impression that an incoming manuscript would cause us dismay at the present time. Panofsky replied, I am touched that you wish this was a letter in relation to a new book. I am touched that you wish to give consideration to my sujet project, though I fell down on the Gothic job so far. But since Sujet Saint-Denis is rightly considered the parent monument of the Gothic style, I could not help going into this matter a little more thoroughly, and thereby fell in love with the great little man and his writings. A telling statement. And then came the other projects, the other distractions, the other lecture series. But I think it's fair to say that without the work on the Gothic style, the ensuing classics would either not have been written or not have taken the shape that they did.
Thank you, Betsy, for a wonderful kind of detective story there, and a real series of revelations as well about Panofsky's thinking and the kind of evolving ideas about Gothic architecture. So thank you. Just a reminder to everybody that we will take questions and have discussion at the end of each pair of papers, but do put your any questions or comments that you might have into the chat, and we will pick them up after our second paper today, which is by Paul Binsky. Paul is Professor of the History of Medieval Art at the University of Cambridge, and as in some ways this conference seeks to recognise the important role of scholars as teachers, I should also say that it was really Paul's inspirational teaching that made me want to be a medievalist, and Paul that directed me to study with Paul Crossley at the Courtauld. So I, like many others, have a lot to thank him for. But today, kind of complementing the first paper we've heard, Paul will talk about Christine de Pizan-Pesner and Panofsky. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Tom, very much for your warm words. Tom said to the participants that they should, if possible, say some words very briefly about both Peter and Paul. I should say right at the start that of the two of them, I knew Paul personally much better. I mean, I read Peter Kidson's work and admired it and continue to admire it hugely, but I think I probably met him only once and was slightly afraid of him. I was out of the sticks in Cambridge, entering the hallowed portals of the Courtauld, and perhaps felt uncharacteristically cowed by him. But Paul, I should say, in a heartfelt way, was a great friend. We shared many amusing evenings, and I fully salute what Deborah Swallow said right at the start, that when he talked to you he did make you feel like the most important person in the room. That's exactly right. And particularly if you were young, Paul had a really commendable winning sympathy for young scholars and the uncertainties and difficulties that they faced. And of course, he won you over because you knew immediately that he sensed the absurdities of academic life, which are many. He took things very seriously, but he had a slightly contrarian side to him too, which meant that he didn't quite fit in, which of course I loved because I've always felt rather the same. And so both of us, as well as sharing a slightly theatrical turn of phrase sometimes, were basically fans of the symposium as much as the seminar room. So these words are slightly imbalanced towards Paul, but anyway, I think I should just say should just have said something right at the outset about them. And so to my paper, which is in a similar vein to Betsy's admirable introductory talk. In 1404, Christine de Pizan issued her panegyric of Charles V of France, who had died in 1380. Her book is known as Le Livre des Faits et Bonnes Mœurs du Charles V le Sage. It was written at the behest of Charles V's brother, Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, who died that year, 1404. Christine, who needs no introduction, was the daughter of Charles V's astrologer-physician, and her text celebrates King Charles as an embodiment of royal virtue and wisdom, sapientia. I want at the outset of this paper, which is really in 3 parts, to focus briefly on chapter 11, in which Christine shows how Charles was truly an artiste. What is the history of that word, really? Which is to say, in this case, a master of the liberal arts. She explains how he edified in both senses by building religious and other structures. This chapter is of interest both to historians of kingship and the conceptualization of architects as professionals. Indeed, it deliberately constructs an analogy between the 2 roles of governance and of building. Charles, the wise king, is loved for possessing largesse, prudence, justice, and so on. Christine says that prudence and wisdom can be illuminated and exemplified by the mastery of the liberal and mechanical arts, especially the former. One like Charles, who has mastered the liberal arts, is entitled, she says, to be called an artiste. Indeed, he is a très grand artiste. Having gone through Charles's grasp of the trivium and the quadrivium, the liberal arts, Christine states that the artiste is wiser, plus sage, than the expert. The word expert, of course, is related to experiment, experience, and so on. And he's wiser because the artiste understands causes or ends, the telos or purpose of something. Christine calls these ends raison and cause. A cause and a reason are probably 2 different things. It doesn't matter. Reasons which can be explained. Thus, she says, the king also ordains his state, which is laid out. Christine's verb for laying out a state is ordonner, which is to say ordinatio. To support this idea, Christine cites at length, and entirely unsurprisingly, a passage culled from Thomas Aquinas's commentary on Aristotle's Metaphysics, and remarks here that, as you can see, that she's demonstrated that the artist has greater science, an important word in what's going to follow, than the expert who works by hand. She then says, well, these aren't my words. This has all come from Aristotle in his Metaphysics. So the artist has to demonstrate that they are, in the first place, a sure deviser of things and also a prudent setter out of things, organizer of things. Well, Aristotle's Physics had, Physics Book 3, had used the example of the builder and the art of building in exposition of his theory of causality. Aristotle's book Metaphysics Part 1 had placed master craftsmen above manual workers in wisdom and honor because they understand causes. Well, Aquinas went on from this to develop a quasi-political image of the architect as sovereign and empowered to direct and command as princeps. Such a theory isn't found, for example, in Vitruvius. Like Aristotle, Aquinas thinks in terms of proportional analogy between things. So, as the prince stands in relation to his subjects, so the architect stands in relation to the masons under his command. The architect isn't literally a prince, but is prince-like in regard to that relation. And Aristotle had helped us, therefore, to see what we now call scholastics. He had helped what we now call scholastics to understand that the sapiens architectus, the wise architect of Corinthians, also possessed the intellectual dominion enjoyed by superordinate sciences over subordinate sciences. He says it is the function of the wise man to order things. Hence, a prince might also, by analogy, be called an architect. Well, fundamental to this whole scheme was an idea of the subordination of the sciences developed variously by Aquinas, St. Bonaventure, and others. The architect is superordinate in virtue of his possession of science, not just craft, discipline, not just craft knowledge. And that distinction was expressed by the terms scientia, Greek episteme, and ars, Greek techne. The architect understands not just ars, how to do something, but why, to what causal end, i.e. the final cause. And that is the meaning of scientia. In this Aristotelian dispensation, scientific knowledge is a demonstrative state. That's to say, a state of mind capable of demonstrating what it knows to other people. Thus, as Aquinas says, signum scientiae est posse docere. It is the capacity of those who possess science to teach. So, Jakob Burckhardt was far from new in writing of the state as a work of art. The Aristotelian model of causes, which is a form of model of authorship, is important in attributing to patrons causal powers also attributable to the highest artists. Both patrons and artists could be identified to their own advantage as causes or progenitors of works of art. Well, in 2010, under the influence of Alistair Minnis's work on medieval theories of authorship, I published a paper on the impact of Aristotle's doctrines as they became apparent in the so-called Aristotelian prologues prior to the commentaries of Aquinas. Their theory was also derived from Aristotle's physics and metaphysics. At that point, I regret to say that I hadn't come across Christine's intriguing thoughts, which I think affirm and indeed underscore the idea that the discourse of the architect as a model professional, followed by the aspirant surgeons, could not readily be detached from school doctrines which modernity has gathered together loosely under the heading scholasticism. Aristotle, the rhetoricians, Geoffrey of Vansolf, Robert Grosseteste, as well as the scholastics, singled out the architect as a model of what it was to think through an entire problem with a view to understanding its purpose, causally, to envisage the means and ends prior to the act. Well, one scholar of architecture who did note Christine's words, albeit en passant, was Nicholas Pevsner. In his admirable paper written in 1942, The Term Architect in the Middle Ages, published in Speculum that year, published, it must be said, in wartime with phenomenal speed. In this paper, Pevsner traced the rise, fall, and rise again of the term architect. We need to be a little careful because the Latin and Greek forms, architectus, architector, architecton, were not always used in the same way. In particular, Pevsner emphasized the role of the mendicants, led especially by Aquinas, in reformulating the term in such a way that it became available to Renaissance Italy. That view is far from incorrect, though, as I stated in 2010, it descholasticizes the problem by overlooking the work already done in this direction in the mid-13th century by the Aristotelian prologues and the Paris quodlibets made available to me by Ian Way. Much of this stuff is unpublished, so I was grateful to be given more information by Ian on these various exchanges, sort of seminar room exchanges, as it were, in which the terms architecton and scientia are used in exactly this way. Now, Pevsner indeed draws Christine de Pizan precisely into the narrative of humanist revival of the term architect. He says it is of great symptomatic significance in this connection that foreign countries began to revive the use of architecture and architectus at exactly the time that they became aware of Italian humanism and the Italian Renaissance. Thus, Christine de Pizan appears first on French soil to write of architecture, which epithet she applies to King Charles V, together with deviseur and ordinaire of buildings. I'd simply state more simply that French academic doctrine had already formulated this view perfectly clearly by 1250, and certainly by 1300, long before humanism, as it were, in regard especially to the keyword scientia, the certain knowledge of causes. This is a common term in scholastic debate. Paris had in effect produced a model of interest to the Renaissance, but not a Renaissance model. And that places this whole discussion immediately at the heart of the whole question of scholasticism. Still, the nexus of France and Italy at this juncture, around 1400, is of interest to us. Christine de Pizan was born in Venice, but worked in France. In 1399, we learn of another famous exchange, the arrival in Milan of a man called Jean Mignot from Paris, who participated in the famous expertise summoned for the building of Milan Cathedral, from which he was eventually sacked for arrogance and insubordination. A classic instance of what Petrarch had called Gallia Superbia. Ironic when you think that the verb mignoter means to seduce and to tread carefully. Evidently, Jean Mignot did not. Would that more were known about this man. And I should say at this point that this is, I'm afraid, very much a lockdown paper. I haven't been able to do the library work on this that I should have liked, so I stand open to correction on much of what follows. His arrival in Milan in August 1399 is noted in the Annali della Fabbrica del Duomo di Milano. The masters Jean Mignot and James of Bruges, painters accustomed to live in Paris, who left Paris on the 21st of July and arrived in Milan in August. The agreed salary of 20 florins a month to Mignot and 25 to something called Cova, but I think that's a mistranscription. I think it's Kona or Köln with his servant. Given the mention of Bruges, it's a very simple matter to rifle through volume 2 of De Haen's magnificent document Extraits divers on the art of Flanders Antoine Hainaut, where we find at page 790 a reference to a Jacquemart de Bruges living in Valenciennes, at the top there, a date placed around 1400. And this artist may well be the Jacques Koen associated with Milan in the early 1400s, once identified, you will recall, from the works of Panofsky and Melodnice, as the Boussicot master. Koen was employed by Philip the Bold in the early 1400s, and while in Paris in 1398, dictated to Alcarius a treatise on colours. Turning then to page 666 of De Haen's various documents, we find that in 1389 to 1390, this is the bottom line of the lower image, that Philip the Bold was also employing a certain Robert Mignot, tapissier de Monsieur, who was repairing the hangings in his chambers. I have no idea if Robert Mignot and Jean Mignot were related by clan and trade, but if they were, as brothers or as father and son, this might explain why Jean in the first instance is designated in the Milan accounts as painter and not architect. In the later fabric accounts of Milan, page 19, Jean is then designated ingeniere, that's to say engineer, one possessed of ingenium. So let me fly a kite, not for the first time. If they were related, the man advising the cathedral chapter at Milan in 1399 to 1400 was related by trade to an artist employed a few years earlier by Philip the Bold, patron of Christine de Pizan's livre, who was also the patron of Jacques Koen of Paris, with whom Jean travelled to Milan. the patron of Milan Cathedral, Gian Galeazzo Visconti, had made an early marriage to Charles V's little sister, Isabel, and was, of course, brother of Philip the Bold. Well, is this not a coterie? And to tug the kite strings in the gale, is it not interesting that Jean Mignot, in defiance of the pragmatism of Italian experts, issued his celebrated and, to me at least, obvious put down, ars sine scientia nihil est. Knowledge how, ars or techne, amounts to nothing if we do not possess knowledge of causes, scientia. It is, I think, in the highest degree unlikely that Jean reflected deeply on the various and complex positions struck by Aristotelian and Augustinian thinkers on this question, if he even knew about them. It had been the great English Aristotelian and Augustinian Archbishop of Canterbury, one can be both after all, Robert Kilwardby, who died in 1279, who had asked in his De Ortu Scientiarum, whether the carpenter or mason could work without geometry, and concluded that, I quote, the speculative sciences are practical and the practical sciences are speculative. This question, interdependence or hierarchy of the sciences, was at issue in Milan. Well, Jean's retort can be understood, I think, as a schoolroom slogan prioritizing scientia in such a way as to restore the authority of geometry as its embodiment, and so the regiminal authority of the French voice in the expertise. This would reflect the idea that I referred to earlier of the subordination of the sciences. Ars and scientia were not equals in this equation, but unequal terms. The Milanese themselves, after all, had invoked Aristotle's theories explicitly, but inaccurately at just that moment in the chapter proceedings, so exposing the fact that Mignot's Aristotelianism had wrong-footed them and had in effect set the agenda. Jean Mignot, perhaps close to the circles of the ruling houses of France and Burgundy, and their illustrious author, Christine de Pizan, was as good an Aristotelian as he was a Platonist, and as Christine shows, Aristotle's metaphysics and the commentaries upon it, though difficult, were still fashionable and eloquent enough around 1400 to construct a model of the king as artist and the state as a work of architecture. In other words, the path from the mason's yard to the scholar's cell, if not the other way around, might be kept open. Well, to reach the third and final part of my paper, you may now have wondered why I haven't mentioned Panofsky. In 2010, I offered a form of qualified support for Panofsky's insight that there was a nexus of sorts between scholasticism and architecture, not as a symbolic form. Panofsky's formal objectives seem to be unsustainable because all complex works of art, such as buildings, are the products of ordered reasoning, their style regardless. In other words, behind this model is a kind of rise of rationality model that I think is problematical. But where I think one can use it is in regard to the formulation of the schoolroom idea of the professional and author. One can say that, as in so many of Panofsky's works, his magnificent and lofty ambition illuminates. Panofsky, as usual, was onto something. And yet, turning to his short book, Gothic Architecture and Scholasticism, published in 1951, which I first devoured as an undergraduate one afternoon in 1977, I find a curious absence. It isn't the numerous prior publications on the art-scholasticism nexus. I think of Jacques Maritain's thoroughly Thomist book, Art et Scolastique, first translated in 1924. After all, Maritain's book uses the notion of the habitus extensively, an idea which, of course, informs Panofsky's neo-Kantian mental habit, or symbolic form, which he had derived from Cassira, and which is wrongly attributed, I think, to Pan by Pierre Bourdieu, whose readings of Panofsky's text really got the term habitus going in cultural theory, though it had been around much longer in that context. No, the gap is something much more obvious. Throughout Panofsky's work on the Middle Ages and Gothic is what I can only describe as a Pevsner-shaped hole, if one can imagine such a concept. Nowhere does Panofsky ever, so far as I know, I stand open to correction, but I haven't seen it so far, nowhere does Panofsky engage with or even mention Pevsner's earlier and very germane writings on the medieval art ideas link. The key writings here both appeared in 1942. One I have mentioned, Pevsner's paper in Speculum on the term architect. Panofsky doesn't allude to this obviously useful and like-minded work. The second book of Pevsner was also written in 1942, but was to be published only in 1945 after the war. Pevsner's The Leaves of Southwell. How notable it is, and what a reminder it is to authors that the most influential books are often the shortest. Pevsner's essay aimed to show how the late 13th century carved foliage assumed a new significance, I quote, as one of the purest symbols surviving in Britain of Western thought, our thought in its loftiest mode, end quote. The theory of Pevsner was simple. Emergence of Aristotelian natural science in the 13th century universities brought in its train an interest in the visual arts as a nominalist, particularist description and representation of the observable living world. This, in Pevsner's words, exhibited, I quote, a balance between science and revelation, or between experience and authority, such as Europe had not known since the days of Aristotle. Panofsky, too, had heralded this nominalism as what he called the victory of Aristotelianism. These were peas in a pod intellectually in some important ways. Well, Pevsner's larger agenda, I need hardly say, to the Courtauld Institute was in part to establish a lineage for the English national tradition of empirical scientific inquiry. In his Wreath lectures on the Englishness of English art, he said, I quote, whether one thinks of the utilitarians of the 19th century or of Francis Bacon or of Roger Bacon, Duns and Ockham, they all have in common their unshakable faith in reason and experience. Yet, Pevsner's work is not even noted by Panofsky. And this happened again long after World War II might have provided any excuses for unfortunate oversights. Indeed, in 1962, Panofsky himself delivered a paper to the American Philosophical Society entitled The Ideological Antecedents of the Rolls-Royce Radiator, which entered Pevsner's territory of formalist and collective cultural analysis without once, strikingly, mentioning Pevsner himself. Panofsky himself half-wedded to racial theory. The English, he says, are irrational, partly because of their Celtic legacy, a theme that we encounter in his unpublished work as well, as Betsy has just shown, East, South, West, etc., etc. It is as if Panofsky was intent on formulating the Englishness of English art without noting that it had, in fact, already been done. Were we to neglect the august context in which this paper was delivered, one might just have read it as a parody of Pevsner's Kunstgeography, except that Panofsky knew perfectly well what he was doing, while disclosing some of the less attractive aspects of mid-20th century thinking on identity, to which many fell victim, arguably, Panofsky himself. Well, the explanation for this hole, this Pevsner-shaped hole in Panofsky's thinking is not in fact negligence, willful or otherwise, but rather something simpler and in a way more brutal. Because as Susie Harris first revealed at length in her tremendous study of Pevsner, Pevsner was tainted by his early association with National Socialism, and especially by his loyalty to his teacher, Wilhelm Pinder. Here is Pinder, a prominent Nazi. It was from Pinder that Pevsner had derived his Kunstgeography, so freely broadcast to an innocent and unsuspecting and respectful British public in the BBC Wreath lectures on the Englishness of English art, broadcast in 1955 to the Empire, published in 1956. While it isn't clear that Pevsner was regarded as a strict adherent of National Socialism by the Nazis, it is clear that by 1940, Pevsner had been outed by the expatriate German community. The fatal and unfortunately very public step was taken by him in May 1940. when Pevsner published a volume on the Academies of Art with CUP. He chose to dedicate the book to his teacher, Pindar, to WP, in grateful and faithful remembrance of the past. According to Harris, this small gesture was held against Pevsner as a gesture of support for the Nazi movement. Well, not everyone reacted exactly badly to this astonishing act of naivety, though they perhaps registered their thoughts more indirectly, and perhaps no less effectively. Otto von Simpson, for example, admittedly also a pupil of Pindar, but like Pevsner of Jewish ancestry, cites Pevsner's 1942 paper in his book on the Gothic cathedral, 1956, but dismisses it vigorously from a Neoplatonic position, as we might expect. He basically just offers it sleight of hand. However, Panofsky's reaction to Pevsner's dedication was explosive in more than one sense. Here I'm grateful to Betsy, who sent some material on to me, turning to Dieter Wuttke's edition of Panofsky's Correspondence, volume 2, number 803, at pages 260 to 61. We find Panofsky writing from Princeton to Wolfgang Steckau at Oberlin in September 1940, a few months later. And here is the quotation, which is to say that fundamentally, says Panofsky, the prisoners in internment camps are probably better off because they're in Canada or Australia or in English camps, which the Nazis probably won't bomb out of self-interest. For this reason, I very much hope that Mr. Pevsner, who managed to dedicate a book to Pindar last year, is at large with a bomb's shrapnel in his guts. Unterlieb, I imagine, is a euphemism for something else. My translation is a little free, and it departs from the lofty tone generally adopted by the great penseur of Dürer's Melancholia or early Netherlandish painting. But it captures something very real in an age of real horror. It captures the contempt that Panofsky felt for Pevsner and goes some way to explain the latter's omission, which strikes me as being essentially political, from Panofsky's oeuvre. In effect, Pevsner, to use modern parlance, was cancelled. And yet, had Panofsky taken into account Pevsner's perfectly valid points about the triumph of Aristotelianism, he might have enriched his own account of scholasticism as something which had content as well as form and structure. My musings in this talk were intended to use a single idea brought to our minds by Christine de Pizan to point to areas which might benefit from a bit more work, I'm the first to admit that, but which also might have united those who, though having so much in common, totally fell out. For such is historiography, truly a human science coloured quite as much by the realities of human nature as the life of the mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for a characteristically enlightening paper. Lots to think about there, lots to kind of reflect on, and some surprises too, perhaps. But we have a bit of time now for questions. If anyone would like to put some to Paul or Betsy, do put them in the chat function. And I will read them out. And I'll start off with a question here from Jeffrey Hamburger for Betsy. He writes, Paul Frankel came to the Institute in 1939, in part with Panofsky's help. Although he published his magnum opus, Gothic, only in 1960, he had worked on it for many years prior. Do we know anything about Panofsky's intellectual interactions with Frankel and how they might bear on some of the issues you discussed?
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey. Great question. And I want to say that I recall hearing you give a Courtauld Works in Progress seminar back in the late 70s, before the Gang of Four. Frankel and Panofsky, I have not gone into this deeply, but I think I'll start by saying Edgar Vint once said that it is the effort of the art historian, and he was thinking about the study of the creation of programs and so forth, but it is the effort of the art historian to recover the substance of past conversations. With Frankel Panofsky, one has the issue that they were in the same place, and so conversations are lost. There are a couple of letters, I haven't gone into it deeply, but when Frankel is traveling back to Europe, and he writes and says what's going on as he's creating his Gothic book. And I think they're 48 and 49 at kind of time. And one is that he's going to go to Marburg and look at photographs in Hamann's photo take and so forth. And there's one in which I think I remember that he talks about reading a passage of Sujet and coming to believe Panofsky's reading, meaning that their conversation was a lot about the interpretation of literary documents. I would believe that. More evidence is there of the work with Swarzensky in this period. Hans Swarzensky was a long-term fellow in the 40s before National Gallery and on to the Boston MFA. And the two of them were working flat out together on international style, where he felt he had much new research, where he was coming to know Boucicault and everything. So that was a real collaboration. I think Frankel was a conversation partner. Also, I can say I've gone through some of the Frankel papers in Princeton, and a lot of them are about his desire for a world government, so a kind of utopian post-World War II desire to end local governments and create something above that, which didn't work, did it?
Thanks, Betsy. I might chip in there with a kind of a related question, which is less to do with Panofsky's kind of correspondence, and in a sense with his what you might think of as kind of competitors, which is to say that might one reason for the fact that he never published this book be related not only to the fact that he gets distracted, but that also, I mean, this is in the 1940s, a whole series of really fundamental studies of medieval architecture studied, I mean, including Pesner, as Paul said, but also people like Krautheim, and presumably Panofsky knew that, but others as well. I mean, do you think there's a sense in which his study became kind of outdated, or at least his attempt to distinguish between or to kind of discern this absolute break between, say, Romanesque and Gothic traditions became much harder because of people like Conant and Krautheim and what they were publishing in the early 40s? Did that project of Panofsky's no longer seem feasible, do you think?
This is interesting. As I was looking through the Antecedents chapter, where he begins talking about things like the Irish spirit and the various manifestations, it's a little embarrassing. I think it got a little unwieldy, and I think he was kind of competing with Morey, who is not really a competitor. It wasn't at the same philosophical level, you might say. But I think so I think it got unwieldy, and I think he felt after a point he couldn't go back. Some of it had gone so much further than that. I think he just didn't know quite how to do with it. I think he was a little depleted after early Netherlandish painting, because it was 5 years. And there's also a funny statement where he writes that he felt he had become verdumped. He had become kind of stupid, made stupid by working so long on early Netherlandish painting in it as a joke. He wasn't saying that because it was much more about devotion. It was not as much about thought and the kind of Aristotelianism or the intellect. And that's why he went on to Kepler. I think it just got way out of date in his own life, but I think it's quite right to think it may have been almost insurmountable. He could not go back because he would have had to come to terms with a larger literature. That's a very good point.
Thank you. And then a question for Paul, which has to do with the kind of reciprocity of this relationship between Panofsky and Pesner. I would need to check some bibliography in Pesner, but so you've talked about Panofsky's attitude to Pesner, but what about the other way around?
Oh, well, that's a very good question. I haven't actually systematically studied that. So I'm going to flunk on your very first question. He doesn't, to the best of my knowledge, he couldn't have done in the 1940s referred to Panofsky's work, because Panofsky's work wasn't published at that point. If you mean his general attitude to Panofsky, I imagine he was, well, he does, now that I think about it, he does refer to what he calls subjectology. You know, that there's that passage in Pevsner writing somewhere, where he dismisses iconography as what he calls subjectology, a rather sort of cozy way of expressing it. And you know, intellectually, I don't think he was necessarily given to iconological readings of things. Of the two of them, I did go to Pevsner's lectures. I don't recall him ever mentioning Panofsky either way, but I'm sure in the court, I'm sorry to flunk, but I'm sure in the court there will be people who know far better, who knew Pevsner far better than I, who could fill me out on that one.
You know, I could just chime in to say that Pevsner was very much known to the Warburg Circle. There's all kinds of connection. So he was part of a greater emigre circle to some degree, and you know, right there at Kirkbeck, he was just, you know, nearby.
I mean, Pevsner wasn't a polemicist, you know, and I'm not aware that he took a particularly negative view of people. The surprising, the extraordinary thing is just how bitter Panofsky was about this, on the other hand. For many years, I wondered why I couldn't find any reference, and it was only looking through the correspondence that it becomes horribly clear what the problem was. I don't think the feeling was mutual.
Thank you. So I have another question from Amy Gillette, which I think either of you might wish to answer. She says, thank you so much for such stimulating talks. I wonder whether either speaker would share their thoughts on the ways in which Panofsky engaged with modernity or modernism, and what their works, that is per se or as interpreted by Kitson and Crossley, continue to offer to postmodern scholars.
Would you like me to say? I've got something on the tip of my tongue, so I'll say it, but not and then Betsy can set me straight, because we're both. Betsy very kindly referred to helping her, but Betsy has done a really extraordinary job in editing this material. My task will be much more limited. But I was thinking about exactly this problem as Betsy was speaking, actually, and particularly this extraordinary passage about parentage and the sort of genetic business, because it strikes me, if I may generalize, and I'm quite prepared to be shot down, after all, we're better to be shot down in this august context, that by saying that I think Panofsky really is, I mean, the whole account of Gothic in the 1940s that he offers should really be set aside alongside the accounts that Branner and other people. It's a very modernist account in the sense that he's seeing Gothic as a new movement. Bonny is not so very dissimilar, though Panofsky's line is a little more sort of hardline. He sees it as a separate thing. He sees it as a movement. He sees it in the modernist sense as something that has a manifesto. And I think, like all modernist movements, there has to be some sort of statement of belief. And of course, he finds that in Sujet. And isn't it interesting in that extraordinary letter that Panofsky sends fobbing off an editor that I'm really much more interested in? God, I wish I had the cojones to do that. But it tells you something. And what it tells you is that the manifesto almost comes first, you know, as one might expect with Panofsky. And in that sense, you know, his modernism, I think, is very evident. And I think we need to think a little bit more clearly about that when in presenting these early lectures. And of course, the other thing is his relentlessly Platonic perspective, which I've critiqued on other occasions, and I see as not incompatible. Of course, he's like von Simpson, de Bruyn. You know, there is this high, lofty, theologized Neoplatonic viewpoint, which is very well known. It doesn't need me to comment on. And of course, there's been a bone of contention ever since. Paul, I was never clear whether Paul believed in the pseudo-Dionysus. Peter PK clearly didn't, and I think at one point calls Panofsky silly. He clearly had his moments, Panofsky. But anyway, so it strikes me that PK brought a kind of empiricist skepticism about ideas to the conversation. Paul, I think, didn't. I think Paul was always very much more defensive of ideas more generally, and I think there was a very interesting antagonism, if I may hazard the comment, between him and his teacher, actually, that Paul was both an empiricist and a historiographer and theoretician. Betsy, I'm sorry, I've yabbered on.
No, fascinating. And yes, I think that particular kind of British deflation by calling something silly or nonsense, and
exactly.
Where to go from there? Yeah, I often kind of, is that quite fair? But I think Panofsky is very much a man of his time. Everybody obviously has to be situated. The interesting thing is if the thought experiment is worth going through again. And I think people of his caliber actually do have something to say. I think people sometimes take him as though he's trying to pull one over on us. There was such suspicion in the late 80s. My God, that's the world I grew up in. And I think it was curiously ungenerous. I think it was more the impact of him and the resentment of this juggernaut that he let loose, which he did. The power of the works is an extraordinary thing worth study. And the power of the reaction is equally interesting and worth study. I recently have been working on the Aesthetics Congress, as they called it, of 1930 in Hamburg. And so I began to realize that Panofsky was very much involved with the Society for Aesthetics and General Art Theory, that he in 1913 and Cassirer and Warburg were there in this interdisciplinary philosophical aesthetic art theoretical conclave. And it was making me realize what the big aesthetic issues were of the time, that we tend not to look, I tend not to look, we're in art history, and I'm so much Warburg Circle, as you move out into Greater Weimar and into the greater philosophical realm in which that he inhabited, you find, all sorts of things, right? In that first one, Lamprecht is talking about parallelism, and just all the way along. And I was just working on a paper on somebody who was talking about the new Raumgefühl, the new sense of space in art and music. And Panofsky raises his hand in another lecture and says, well, I think you can draw a parallel between art and aesthetics, like I do in my book Hercules am Scheidewege, which was just coming out. And so it was almost like a high task, and it's not an ignoble one, to see if you can get cultures together, if you can make sense of things. Are there parallels? What would it mean if there are parallels? What is good method? What is bad method in finding these parallels? And this, we do it all the time. We can say we don't, but of course we do. Of course we do. Oh, that's so 1980s. What is that? That's a statement of that's so Gothic. So on one level, we really are doing that constantly. But on another, to look at it philosophically, something that it's not just that architecture is influencing it. Just heard a lecture by Sergio Sanabria, who says that Panofsky had it wrong, flip it over, and architecture is in fact giving the scholastics their framework. That you have to go that way.
May I say that's what I argued in 2010, and I argued precisely that we have to turn Panofsky on his head.
Upside down.
Because rhetoric and Aristotle constantly uses the architect as the model for what it is to think. It's always the architect, or conceivably the surgeon, doctor. The word fabrica can of course mean both human body and building. So that I think is exactly right, that we do need to turn it. Sorry, Betsy.
Exactly right. And we'll just end by saying that it's to examine on a philosophical basis the act of drawing cultural parallels as a way of gaining understanding, which is our stakes, right, is one we do all the time. Every interdisciplinary act is in fact getting at that. So here is a thoughtful person working with the philosophical means of the time, the excitement of Cassirer, the excitement of Foucault, the excitement of Derrida. We all work with the exciting figures. And so I think we put it as an experiment. I think we have to give him a little bit of credit for jeu d'esprit, for a kind of buoyancy, for a kind of joy in intellectual work, and not have this school marmish, don't think so, oh, got it wrong there. This was a, I don't like this premise, I don't like that one, which is what we do for him, toward him, in a way we don't for other people. It's just been, he was so much the man one loved to hate for a long time. And it's almost a knee-jerk reaction now. So even though I grew up in this, I'm kind of pulling back from it at this point, just saying.
Thank you. I have another question here from Michele Tomasi, who writes, thanks to both speakers for their fascinating talks. I was especially interested by the paper by Paul Binsky, so I am myself writing an article on the 1962 article by Panofsky. Oh. I wonder if he has any comment on the very interesting title and its choice of words. Why does Panofsky put in the title the words ideological antecedents?
Oh God! I wondered the same thing, because it's not a very Panofskian term, is it? Ideology. I mean, I may be set right on this one. I simply don't know, because the nature of the theory isn't about ideology in the common sense of academic discourse, is it? At least it's a little while since I read it. I should be most grateful if our questioner could provide the answer. I don't really know, actually. It's a puzzle. Sorry.
Okay, well, we will wait to see if Professor Tomasi has any further thoughts on that. But I will have at the moment a question from Elizabeth Den Hartog, who asks, does Panofsky's definition of Gothic, as you read it, not conflict with the so-called High Gothic style, which shows clear Roman influence, at least in sculpture? So I suppose that's principally addressed to Betsy.
Yes, this is a theme I want to pursue. I think you've put your finger on a very interesting issue. He regards, as we saw, Gothic as new and separate from the Mediterranean. And so he makes it a point to look at classicism in the Gothic. What did particularly sculptors do with the classical works that they saw? He gave a lecture on it in German, and there's one in English, I believe, as well. There are a number of lectures I might someday get around to publishing, or somebody will there. And so I can at this point only say that it was a matter of an evolution within Gothic that allowed the artisan to be able to look at the classic. And so he believes it gets in, but only when there is at a phase when it's appropriate, when it's possible, as though the artist can now see something that the artist could not have seen before. I think that's the way he would approach it. But I think there's more there to be said.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have probably time for two more questions which are in the chat. First one from Stephen Murray, who asks, to what extent did the idea of the architect invoked by Christine de Pizan correspond with the real Gothic master mason?
Shall I answer that? When I wrote the paper in 2010, which talked about turning Panofsky on his head, I sent it to Paul. And it was, I think, one of the last intellectual exchanges we had, actually. And I said, please be rough with me and don't spare your criticism. And he didn't. He simply took the view that architects were practical men, that he took the Lon Shelby view of geometry, that it was practical geometry, not theoretical geometry, et cetera, et cetera. And he put that view to me. And I said to him, well, look, this is in a sense to miss the point of what I'm saying. I'm not arguing that architects are scholastics. What I'm talking about is a new discourse in the 13th century, which I think is typical of that period. It's very much under the Aristotelian dispensation. There's a new discourse of what a professional is. And terms like scientia, an interest in causal theory, is very much a preoccupation of that period. In the paper that I wrote, I tried to answer that question, and I think the short answer is, as a statement of what architects actually are, it's not terribly helpful, but it's a statement of what they might have claimed to be, what they wanted to be, or what any professional would want to be. It's not a hard and fast theory about what architects are. What it's about, I'm picking up on a point actually that Jeffrey has sent through too, which is fair enough. I mean, indeed, one has to emphasize that a lot of these ideas have been around a long time, but one really does have to look at the discussions in the 13th century where this is popping up to see that when particularly surgeons start to cite the architects as examples of what to do, just as the so-called scholastics are doing. I think this is, to a certain extent, typical of the time, and it's part of a galvanizing of the sense of what professionalism is, and it's the period also when responsibility is being handed to artists in a way that it hasn't before. Hence the contract. I think a lot of these things have to be or should be discussed together. But I admit it's a phenomenally complicated problem. I've certainly never advanced a hard and fast theory about what architects were. I've merely advanced a much more limited theory with reference to what Panofsky said about what they may have claimed to be in the highest sense. And that's a very Panofskian point of view. It's a very lofty point of view.
Okay,
thank you. Question.
Yes, I think it
in a manner of speaking.
More or less, yes. Well, I think that we should release everyone from their screens for a few minutes to take a comfort break, get much better tea and coffee than you would get in a Courtauld conference at any rate, and generally take a rest. So I would like to thank Paul and Betsy. I'm sorry that we can't give you the rousing applause that I'm sure we're all committed to in our own rooms wherever we are, but thank you very, very much. And to remind everyone that we will meet a few moments before 4 o'clock when we will have our next session. So thank you, Paul and Betsy, and see everyone at 4 o'clock. Okay, well, welcome back to this second session in today's conference, where we pick up on some of the questions and issues that we addressed in the first one. Our first speaker in this session is Alexandre Gallesky, who is reviews editor at the Burlington magazine and has published widely on aspects of medieval art and architecture. And in fact, I think that when she first joined the Courtauld for her PhD, she did so under the supervision of Peter Kidson. But after PK's retirement, Alexandre worked very closely with Paul Crossley and indeed became one of his closest friends. Her talk today is entitled Two Sujets, Kitson, Crossley and Saint-Denis. So over to you, Alexandre.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you. A key figure in medieval art history, the prolific writer and indefatigable patron of the arts, Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis, plays an important role in the scholarship of the two people whose life and work we are celebrating today, Peter Kidson and Paul Crossley. I've been fortunate to have been taught by both PK and Paul. PK during my MA, actually, not my PhD, my MA, and Paul then supervised my PhD together with Lindy Grant. Lindy Grant has also made a key contribution to the Suger debate by publishing the definitive biography of the abbot. Giants spring to mind, and I wouldn't claim I'm standing on their shoulders. It is also to a large part thanks to their generosity and encouragement that those who were their students at the Courtauld in those years have become a close-knit group and friends. And I would like to thank warmly Zoe Opacic for sharing ideas and literature in preparation of this paper. Paying tribute to these two formidable scholars in a single paper is not an easy task. Although his PhD was supervised by PK, Paul took a rather separate scholarly route from that of his mentor. Looking at their impressive and varied contributions to art history, however, the irrepressible figure of Abbot Suger leaps out as a subject they both worked on, and that reflects in a nutshell many of their respective lifelong research interests and approaches. Their interpretations of Suger as a patron demonstrate some fundamental differences between the two, but also reveal profound similarities in their thinking. And as is undoubtedly the case for other topics they have worked on, their studies of Abbot Suger offer, as Kitson anticipated, starting points for further inquiry. Piquet's magisterial essay on Panofsky and Suger in the JWCI from 1987 has been read by generations of scholars and students. It is now best known for its crushing rebuttal of Panofsky's interpretation of Suger as a student of Neoplatonic light metaphysics. Famously, Panofsky had offered a seductively simple theory for why Suger had left what Panofsky called retrospective accounts of his intentions and accomplishments, so his writings. Although Panofsky did not spell this out, his theory also offered a satisfyingly plausible explanation for how Gothic came to be born at Saint-Denis. For Panofsky, Suger was a parvenu, it's the word he actually uses. Small and vain, though amiable and infatuated with gold and gems. Intimidated by the invectives of St. Bernard against gold in churches, he found in the texts by Pseudo-Dionysius, whom he considered to be the church's patron saint, a justification to continue embellishing his church, thus becoming a student of Neoplatonic light metaphysics. Piquet's brilliant, razor-sharp dissection of Panofsky's arguments revealed this sujet to be nothing more than art historical fiction. Suger's writings, Piquet argued, contained no knowledge of light metaphysics. At best, Suger was a diluted Platonist whose rhetoric brought heaven down to earth rather than the other way around. Far from being a Platonist, Piquet memorably concluded, Suger discloses himself as a proto-Jesuit. This dismissal of Suger as a theologian allowed Piquet to arrive at his central contention, which was to shift the responsibility for the radically innovative design of the East End of Saint-Denis from the patron to the unknown architect. Paul's thoughts on Suger are dispersed in several publications. His 1988 article on medieval architecture and meaning in the Burlington magazine, we recently did a study at the Burlington magazine to see what articles were most downloaded from JSTOR. And this article by Paul was among the first 5. Also, Paul published a couple of paragraphs at the end of his article in the Festschrift for Madeleine Caveness from 2009, and then he addressed it again towards the end of his life in his Slate lectures in 2012, which he then revised, and where he also revised his earlier ideas. For the Festschrift essay, Paul examines the idea of holism and Gothic architecture, which also included a reconsideration of some of his earlier ideas. Having demonstrated that ultimately the copious chaos of medieval buildings proves resistant to our attempts at unifying explanation, Paul added a coda on Suger's repeated insistence on the convenientia and coherentia, the concordance and harmony of the new and the old work in the Abbey Church. He found in Suger's description of the consecration ceremony of the new choir on the 11th of June, 1144, evidence of what the abbot wanted this choir to be. A key phrase for Paul is Suger's expression, res publica una, in the concluding prayer, in which the abbot envisages his material church and the heavenly kingdom to merge into a single state. Paul recognized in this Ciceronian gloss on a famous reference in a letter by his namesake Paul to the Ephesians, to the that says that the church sees the church as the habitation of all the faithful, founded on the prophets and apostles, with Christ as a chief cornerstone. The idea that the various parts of the Church of Saint-Denis were brought into harmony for Suger, harmony with each other, but also with the invisible heavenly church through the movement of the procession and the ritual of the consecration liturgy, goes back to Andreas Speer and must have struck a note with Paul. As he explained, his particular interest in the holistic cathedral concerned what might be called its sacred topography, the way images and installations form meaningful relationships within the space of a church, a subject he had first explored in 1998 for his essay on St. Sebald in Nuremberg, and to which he returned in his article on ductus and Memoria at Chartres in 2010. At first, the two sujets that emerged from these studies seem to be polar opposites. Piquet Suger is not an intellectual or a theologian. He is an able administrator, firmly grounded, who sees no contradiction between his religious beliefs and his delight in material beauty. Paul Suger is deeply spiritual and keenly aware that behind the world of appearances is another, that of heaven and the divine. One thing to keep in mind when considering the differences between these two sujets is the fact that 20 years of scholarship lie between them. In her biography of the abbot of Saint-Denis, Lindy has presented new evidence for an interpretation of Suger that debunked Panofsky's slightly vulgar but genial abbot once and for all. According to Lindy, Suger was tough but just, highly orthodox, not an innovator, an able abbot and politician, and a committed defender of the rights of the church and his abbey. He is Paul in his Slate lecture, paying tribute to some of the results of Lindy's research. Paul said Lindy Grant had little difficulty proving that St. Bernard had no corrective influence on Suger and never threatened the abbot. As for the pseudo-Dionysius, Grant conceded that Suger must have been aware of the corpus of his writing in his monastic library, but the higher obscurities of the pseudo-Dionysius' negative theology would not have detained Suger, busy man of affairs, for long, unquote. Paul had also read Eric Fernie's article in Artistic Integration of 1995, and of course the publications by Paul Binsky, in particular Beckett's Crown, which he had read very carefully as it tackles exactly the question of correspondences between ideas and art. In addition, he studied Christoph Markschies, Hans-Peter Neuhäuser, and Andreas Speer, whom I've already mentioned. It should also be noted that there was a general interest among architectural historians in liturgy in those years, but Paul in particular was fascinated by Margot Fassler's Gothic Song, a book which he read extensively. As a result, Paul was not concerned in his essay with the pseudo-Dionysius and with the question whether there was a direct link between light metaphysics and the architecture of the choir. That question had been answered. His exposition on Suger's concluding prayer, with its references to the heavenly Jerusalem, were not intended, therefore, to show that Suger was a Neoplatonist. By distinguishing between the worlds of appearances and reality, heaven and the divine, Suger professed the belief that he shared with all other clerics of the day. In an email to me about Saint-Denis from 2005, Paul argued that, quote, the relationship between text and architecture is largely one of reception, of appreciation, description, and evaluation. What clerics say about buildings is fascinating and is part of understanding what they meant to their users and patrons, but they do not explain stylistic change or stylistic choice. There are no two camps here, but if push comes to shove, I would be in Piquet's. That what makes architecture interesting is what architects do with the brief the patrons give them, unquote. Therefore, as different as Piquet's and Paul Suger's might appear on the essential question of the respective roles of the patron and the architect, the two entirely saw eye to eye. The patron might know exactly what he wants, as Piquet argued, but thinking imaginatively about architectural problems and working out subtle and effective solutions was the territory of the architect. Suger deserves our salutations because he employed an architect of genius. What invalidates Panofsky's interpretation of Suger is, for both Piquet and Paul, the fact that it is ultimately not historical. There is no evidence for an engagement with pseudo-Dionysian theology in Suger's writings. Panofsky's biography is psychological rather than historical, and as Lindy has shown, inflected by his own patrician background, which made him wince at the abbot's seeming lust for gold and gems. The cause and effect relationship between theology and architecture that Panofsky sought to establish places Panofsky's study within the tradition of idealist cultural history, which Paul showed to be deeply flawed. Both PK and Paul were highly skeptical of the idea that medieval patrons wanted to turn symbolic meanings into literal ones. Both thought that conventional allegories, symbolisms, and analogies, when they appear in texts describing churches, are largely ex post facto, the image being suggested by the building, not the other way around. For example, on the question of the 12 columns, which Suger in De Consecratione likened to the 12 apostles, Piquet pointed out that if Suger had started out with this idea, it would mean that he was willing to adapt the number of altars in his new choir to the image, since the number of altars depended on the number of columns and bays. And Piquet emphasized that a much more likely and simpler explanation is that the image was suggested to him by the building. This is not to say that Piquet and Paul thought that Suger had no influence on the design. His writings, as Lindy has also argued, suggest a patron who is deeply involved and knows what he wants. The relationship between patron and architect envisaged here is one in which the architect is there to solve problems for the patron. Thus, Paul, in talking about the difference between the dark crypt and the light-filled upper choir, thought that it is difficult to imagine Suger's architect devising these nuances of function and meaning. For Piquet, the problems that Suger might raise were not in any special sense iconographical, but could be formal, aesthetic, even theatrical, unquote. And of course, theatrical in a church is really liturgical. I think that Piquet, Lindy might know better, but I think that Piquet was also deeply interested in this question of the effect of liturgy on architecture. Of course, Alexander Sturgis, Piquet's PhD student, wrote his thesis on the liturgy and its relations to Gothic cathedrals, showing, however, that the ordinals at Chartres and Reims had to accommodate the building rather than the other way around. But that the question was so interesting for Piquet is also shown by the fact that, in fact, in his JWCI article, Piquet went on to demonstrate a specific case in which Suger's requirements changed the course of the building. Piquet's observation was based on a short paper by Sumner McKnight Crosby in Jester in 1966. In it, Crosby represented the various irregularities the archaeologist of Saint-Denis had recognized in the choir design. He had noted that there were differences in the distances between the chapels, which had been designed with the help of distinct radii. From this, Crosby deduced that the choir plan was based on a geocentric model of the cosmological system presented by Ptolemy in his Almagest. As you can imagine, Piquet had no difficulty dismissing this further attempt at using a great idea to account for the design of Saint-Denis. As only Piquet could, he made sense, however, of Crosby's discovery. In fact, the unknown article, now for Piquet's drawing, which makes much more sense. In fact, the unknown architect mustered all his knowledge of geometry to push the three easternmost chapels even further eastwards by using a different radius from here to there for the three eastern chapels, different from the radii he used for the three northern and southern chapels. For Kitson, the importance given to these three eastern chapels could not have been based on their consecration, for although the central chapel was dedicated to the Virgin, the two adjacent chapels dedicated to Saints Cucuphas and Peregrinus, quote, hardly seemed to qualify for special emphasis, unquote. The chapels were pushed eastwards out of a desire, quote, not to interrupt and disturb the even sequence of the windows. The windows were the distinctive contribution, PK argued, contribution made by Suger, and also the raison d'etre of the whole design. In that sense, Saint-Denis was Suger's special creation indeed. Piquet's analysis of the extension of the East End recalls an observation. Oh, sorry, this slide was just there to show the uninterrupted view of the windows, which of course we all know. Piquet's analysis of the pushing eastwards of the East End recalls an observation made by Werner Jacobsen in a key article from 2002 on the liturgical dispositions of Saint-Denis Abbey Church. Jacobsen said, Suger's new ambulatory choir remained strangely empty. Having largely remained in place until the refurbishment of 1627, the liturgical fittings installed by Abbot Suger in his new East End included the golden crucifix at number 8, the altar and shrine of Denis and his companions Eleutherius and Rusticus at number 9, and according to Jacobsen, quote, behind a large and empty inner choir. For Jacobsen, this suggested that Suger's East End must have served functions other than those the abbot mentioned in his writings, which Jacobsen lists as making the tomb of Denis and his companions more visible than before, providing space for the altar of Denis, and to accommodate pilgrims. In the space behind the tomb monument, Jacobsen suggests Suger also intended to provide a location for an important new ritual, the king's reception of the Oriflamme prior to their departure to war. Jacobsen's suggestion that the retrochoir was used for the Oriflamme ceremony cannot be accepted without some questioning. As Lindy has explained, Saint-Denis' banner, the vexillum of the Vexin, was not conflated with Charlemagne's Oriflamme before the late 12th century. The ceremony was first staged in 1124 in the Old Choir, when Louis the Fat went into war against the King of England and the German Emperor. Then Suger brought out the 3 silver chests from the crypt. The ceremony was not restaged in the new choir until 1147, when Louis VII went for crusade. Could Suger really have foreseen the longevity of the ritual, which was performed occasionally then until the 15th century? On the other hand, Lindy does see Suger as a moving spirit behind the idea of the ceremony. In the new shrine, here is a drawing by Panofsky, which we know from Blaise de Montesquieu Fezensac is not actually entirely correct. But it gives us a very good idea. In the new shrine, the relics of Denis and his companions were arranged as in the old crypt in 3 parallel stalls. The shape of the new shrine, with a lower tomb where the relics were kept, and a raised upper section, the tabernacle, was very different from the feretory that became widespread in the Gothic period, where the relics were raised above the altar. Suger's shrine recalled an older type of shrine, such as the one at Saint-Martin in Tours. The fact that the relics of the martyrs could be accessed from a small hatchet behind on the eastern side suggests that Suger envisaged future occasions in which he would elevate the relics, whether he had in mind the ceremony involving the vexillum and the king is open to question. Moreover, as Paul's study of Suger's text suggests, the abbot was keenly aware of the need to harmonize the old opus antiquum and the opus modernum in the new church. Paul suggested, and I can't really do justice to his argument by just referring to them here very briefly, a very interesting argument. Paul suggested that Suger put these old and new parts deliberately into contrast with each other to show how they reflect on each other, really using the older things, the older objects, parts of the church as spolia within the new church, in a way to show that there was continuity in the Abbey church. And so behind the shrine, here number 7, there is arguments to be made that various old objects were displayed. The so-called throne of Dagobert, Carolingian probably, was probably there, definitely in the 16th century, but possibly earlier. The porphyry tub, now in the Musée du Louvre, was certainly there in the 13th century behind the shrine. And the oriflamme was also there in the 16th century, according to the inventory attached to the shrine of Denis. Also, we know that at early occasions, it had also been in the treasury. But it's well possible that there was this display for longer periods and possibly intended by Suger. All this may help to explain the need for this long apse. But another crucial comment comes from Piquet's essay on the geometry of the choir. Piquet observed that, quote, the starting point for the choir's design was a list of altars for which the appropriate architectural expression was a formation of chapels around part of a polygon. And that polygon he also showed to be a 13-sided polygon to allow enough chapels for the saints. And I think this deserves some further discussion, because among the motivations Suger gives for building his new church is the relocation not only of the patron saints, but also of the other saints who scattered about the church were worshipped in different chapels. Who were these saints? Apart from the bodies of the martyrs, the relics that were the longest in possession of the abbey were probably those of Kukiphas and Hippolytus, which may have arrived at Saint-Denis under Hilduin in the 9th century. But it was in the 11th century that the cult of saints really started to prosper at the abbey. There's 2 documents that attest to that, a fragment of a mass and a fragment of a sacramentary. Both list the saints whose bodies now rest in this church, a phrase that was still used in the 18th century. They are, of course, Denis, Eleutherius, and Rusticus, but also Eugenius, Peregrinus, Hippolytus, Kukiphas, Innocent, Eustace, Patroclus, Firminus, Hilary of Poitiers and Hilary of Mont, Romanus and Osmana, all of the saints that Suger placed in the chapels behind the shrine. Not all of them are well known, of course. The well-known saints, like Christophorus, were all in the crypt. But they were all martyrs, evangelizers, and virgins. Little mini-me's of Denis and his companions, they mirrored their sanctity and they circled around the shrine like planetoids orbiting the sun. Suger's intentions were made clear in the consecration ceremony that Paul talked about. During this ritual, he united the martyrs with the saints, henceforth to be joined together in the upper choir. On the day of the dedication, the procession carrying the relics split into 2. One led by Suger and Louis VII, carrying the bodies of the martyrs, which they had extracted from the old Confessio, and the other consisting of the bishops and nobles carrying the saints, which had been placed in tents at the exit of the monks' choir overnight, before they met at the ivory door, probably leading from the church to the cloister. Holding candles and crosses, they processed together through the cloister back into the church and into the upper choir, where the bishops proceeded with the dedications, a kind of marriage ceremony, I would suggest. Edward Foley and Anne Waters Robertson, who studied the ordinaries of Saint-Denis, have shown that by 1233, regular processions took place to the chapels on the feast days of these saints after Vespers and Lauds, and for the principal Mass, which was celebrated on their altar. Pilgrims, the question of pilgrimage is complicated, but Suger certainly intended his East End as a space for pilgrims, as Lindy has shown. And the processions were probably also going back to Suger's times. Therefore, the need for extra space in the church, I think, at base is down to the need to place these altars in the chapels, individual altars for these important saints. From that derive also the columns, from that derives the extended large space behind the shrine in the hemicycle, which could then be used for displays of spolia and for ceremonies that were to become then the oriflamme ceremony. In conclusion then, despite the rather different trajectories of Paul's and Piquet's research interests, they both shared a deep fascination with the practicalities of the building site and the creativity of the architect. They both questioned patronal contributions, in particular rejecting any universal causal relationships between ideas and the architecture. The ideas, findings, and approaches both have left us will provide rich source for the next generation of scholars to come, and in that sense, they still will be with us for many years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, for this wonderful reading of the building through the scholarship of Paul and PK, very much in the spirit of PK's reading of a number of major buildings. A reminder once again that the discussion will come after our second paper, but do feel free to put any questions you have into the chat function, and we will try to make time for those questions at the end. But for now, it is my pleasure to introduce the second speakers in this session, who will also examine to some extent this question of the holistic cathedral. Peter Kuhlman and Brigitte Schwartz are professors of medieval art at the University of Freiburg and Zurich, respectively. And over 2 long careers, they've really transformed understanding of medieval architecture, sculpture, and stained glass in France, Germany, Switzerland, and beyond. And in this paper, for this conference, they will speak on rural images in Strasbourg Cathedral's Gothic nave, the conceptual transformations and place in historiography. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you as well. Dear friends and colleagues, Peter and I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to this conference. Before I go medias in res, we also thank Alexandre Gallesky for giving our text a good English form. We both met Paul Crossley in the 1980s for the first time, and later saw him several times at the colloquia of the Corpus Vitriarum, a paper on the Strasbourg stained glass windows in a meeting dedicated to 2 architectural historians is therefore not so far-fetched. Gothic architecture, with its imagery, was one of the central interests of both Peter Kidson and Paul Crossley, in whose memory this conference takes place. It would not have surprised Paul Crossley that our paper, given in honor of our late colleagues, addresses images of medieval kings and emperors in the medium of stained glass. Like no other artistic genre, Gothic architecture's Gothic stained glass, is linked to architecture. It is an integral part of the building, continuing the wall where the stonework stops. Moreover, the reference to kingship found in a sacred context was a theme prominent in Paul Crossley's writings. However, as he himself put it, each age builds its own Gothic cathedral. It is not only research into architecture that it's changing, but also that into imagery associated with buildings. The assessment of stained glass has undergone several important changes since the 19th century. Initially, art history classified stained glass as purely decorative and belonging to the applied arts. It was not until the founding of the Corpus Vitriarum in 1952 that stained glass became widely accepted as a genre of monumental painting that participated in the general development of style, just like wall and panel painting. Only in the second half of the 20th century did art history finally turn away from the romantic idea that the colored glass was merely intended to intensify the religious aura of church interiors. In fact, as part of the Christian cult building, the message of stained glass to the viewer was in no way different from that of the carvings and paintings of the altars and the images of the wall paintings. This can be demonstrated particularly well by the example of the Strasbourg series of rulers. In what follows, the Strasbourg royal images will first be presented in the state they were left after the changes made in 1877. Afterwards, we will examine the central question raised by previous scholarship. Since the 1940s represent a profound turning point for the historiography of the Strasbourg stained glass, a look at the research published before the middle of the 20th century is indispensable and needs to take into account Strasbourg's changing geopolitical situation. The particularly virulent question of national allegiance in Alsace had an impact not least on art history. We will conclude with an outlook on questions concerning the royal images that are as yet unanswered and remain controversial and should therefore continue to be of concern to art history. The images of the kings and emperors originally occupied the 7 4-light windows in the north aisle of the Strasbourg nave. They present themselves to the viewer frontally aligned in a solemn row. In the original arrangement, they were faced on the south side by prophets and apostles, whereas only fragments and 19th century drawings of 2 of the prophets have survived from the original glazing of the south aisle. 5 remaining windows of the north aisle still contain figures of rulers. I hope you can see the watercolor from the prophets from 1854. The rulers form 2 groups, one of which placed in windows 13 and 15 was created around 1180. The stained glass windows of this first group originally decorated the early Romanesque nave of the cathedral built by Bishop Werner around 1000. About the middle of the 13th century, they were integrated into the new Gothic glazing of the aisle windows that opened into the 2 eastern bays of the Gothic nave. The second group, placed in windows 7, 9, and 11, was created between around 1265 to 1275. In other words, after construction had been suspended in the early 1260s. Both groups consist of frontal figures distinguished by the crown, scepter, and orb as rulers. The figure of Charlemagne here also holds a sword. Inscriptions in the frames of the halos surrounding the heads of the figures designate them as emperors and kings of the empire. Whereas previous research has been almost exclusively interested in the inscribed names, the existence of the halos has remained largely unnoticed. These mark the entire row as holy. Also, only Charlemagne and Henry II were considered saints. The rulers wear long tunics below a paludamentum, a coat fastened on the right shoulder, as worn by military commanders. Only a few figures deviate from this scheme, their cloak being fastened on the chest. There is no doubt that the Strasbourg kings and emperors evoked the robes worn by the Roman German rulers at their coronation in Aachen. Anyone walking along the northern aisle from west to east today will no longer see the figures in the original arrangement described, and will also notice drastic changes in the architecture of the northern aisle. The loss of the two easternmost windows, which had to make way for St. Lawrence's Chapel in 1515 to 1522, is most noticeable. In addition to a lancet of the first western window was walled up during the construction of the west facade. In the remaining 3 lancets of this window and in the 4 lancets of the adjacent one, 7 Romanesque rulers of the first group were inserted, 3 at an unknown date, 4 in 1877. These are windows 15 and 13 according to the census of the Recensement des Vitraux Anciens de la France. Walking from west to east, the viewer recognizes the only completely preserved Romanesque figure named Henricus Rex here on the left. This is followed to the east by a Fridericus Rex, this one, and a Henricus Imperator Babinbergensis, the right one. The latter 2 figures are composed of bodies from around 1180 and heads from the 3rd quarter of the 13th century, whereby only the body of Frederick came from a ruler, while that of the figure on the right belonged to a prophet with a scroll. Of the 4 figures in the following windows, only Otto Rex here still has a medieval inscription. All the other figures were reconstructed by the cathedral's architect Gustav Klotz in 1877 from fragments that have previously filled gaps in the clerestory windows. The preserved figures of the Gothic row of monarchs, those of the 2nd group, are in the windows numbered 7, 9, and 11 of the north aisle and were also rearranged under Klotz in 1877. From west to the east in window 11, a King Philip, here the first one, 2 others named Henry, one referred to again as Babinbergensis and the other as Claudus, limping, and a Frederick with the epithet Imperator Submersus, the drowned emperor. In the next window to the east in number 9, 4 Carolingians follow from Charles Martel to Louis the Pious. Then in the last window, before the arcades opening onto St. Lawrence's Chapel, number 7, 4 younger Carolingians who are, however, difficult to identify except for Emperor Lothar, this one here, in Emperor Lothar. In general, the identification of the kings and emperors is difficult, if not impossible. Names like Henry, for example, with different sovereigns, repeat themselves like the Imperator or Rex Babinbergensis, and 2 of the later Carolingians who are both called Ludovicus Filii Lothari. The epithets Imperator or Rex Babinbergensis and Claudus certainly refer to Henry II, who was thus represented 3 times in the Gothic series. The Imperator Submersus most probably means Frederick I, first called Barbarossa, who drowned in Turkey in 1190. Finally, the Philippus Rex, this one, and could be Barbarossa's youngest son, Philip of Swabia, who was murdered in Bamberg in 1208. The stylistic classification of the series of rulers and the associated question of dating is the only common thread running through the relevant literature. Already at the beginning of modern research into stained glass windows in Strasbourg Cathedral, authors such as Abbe Gerber, 1848, and Franz Xaver Kraus, 1876, stated that the series of kings and emperors of the empire was composed of stylistically different figures. However, as early as 1857, this was contradicted by Ferdinand de Lasteyrie in his monumental work on French stained glass. In his opinion, it was impossible for Romanesque stained glass to be fitted into Gothic traceries. For all authors up to the Second World War, a fire that broke out near the cathedral in 1298 and spread to the building site of the west facade provided a chronological point of reference. The first is reported the fire is reported in the Chronicle of Ellenhard, whose author was Gubernator Fabrice from 1284 to 1304. According to the anonymous opinion of all older authors, the Romanesque stained glass windows were created before this date, the Gothic one was after. It was Fridtjof Zschokke who, in his dissertation of 1942, put the question of style and dating on a completely new base. He made a clear distinction between the Romanesque and the Gothic stained glass, and he was the first to recognize that the older group consisted of reused glass from the early Romanesque cathedral. He also saw that the style of these stained glass windows was closely related to the miniature of the Hortus Deliciarum created between 1178 and 1195. Zschokke defined the formal design of the miniatures and the glass as the local style of Strasbourg. Yet Zschokke's study goes beyond the analysis of Romanesque stained glass, for it also contains specific statements about the cathedral's Gothic glazing. On the one hand, based on archaeological observation, the author established that Strasbourg Cathedral's Gothic glass largely reproduced the iconographic program of Bishop Werner's building. On the other hand, he made it clear that the fire of 1298 was insignificant for the chronology of the Gothic stained glass, because in his view, most of the glass was created during the construction period of the nave between circa 1250 and 1275. The fire of 1298 caused damage only to the glass in the windows of the first two bays from the west, which was replaced in the 14th century. World War II prevented a quick reception of Gothic Zschokke's findings. In 1949, 7 years after the publication of his dissertation, it was reviewed by the German art historian Hans Wenzel, who, as a cultural officer, was responsible for Strasbourg stained glass during the war. Wenzel agreed with most of Zschokke's findings. He corrected him only regarding the reuse of Romanesque royal figures. As Wenzel convincingly demonstrated, these had not been inserted in the side aisle windows in the post-medieval period, as Zschokke thought, but must have already been systematically integrated into glazing in the Gothic period. Wenzel's view was adopted by his doctoral student Rüdiger Bexmann in his 1967 dissertation on the architectural framing of the Gothic window. The canopies under which the emperors and kings stand play a key role in Bexmann's study. Those above the Romanesque kings are among the oldest painted canopies in stained glass that reproduced real forms of built Gothic architecture. In Bexmann's opinion, in other regions of the empire and even in France, this phenomenon occurred later. Thus, Strasbourg would offer one of the earliest, if not the earliest, example of the architectonization of pictorial art typical of the Gothic period. Following Wenzel, Bexmann maintains that the Romanesque kings were reused during the first building campaign of the Gothic nave. Reinhardt adopted all these hypotheses in his monograph of Strasbourg Cathedral, published in 1972. Also, the focus of the scholarly discussion was on the dating of the series of monarchs. Authors also tried to determine its place in the history of art. This attempt were not free of nationalistic undertones, especially in the older literature. Heinrich Uitmann emphasized in his book on Rennes stained glass of the Middle Ages, published in 1912, that the coloring of the Romanesque glass fragments of Strasbourg Cathedral was entirely unlike the colors of French glass. A completely different judgment was offered in Meisterwerke der Glasmalerei from 1951, the only comprehensive study of the medieval stained glass of all German-speaking countries. Its author, Hans Wenzel, considered the Romanesque Strasbourg kings as the fruit of an artistic encounter with the early stained glass in Saint-Denis and Chartres. Wenzel even detected fashionable Western fashion features in the 13th century Strasbourg figures. A fresh assessment of the Strasbourg stained glass on the French side, published in 1958 and 1977, is due to Louis Gothic. Like the Swiss Fridtjof Jocke, he sees local Strasbourg artists at work in both the Romanesque and Gothic stained glass campaigns. Nevertheless, for him, at least, the Gothic stained glass of Strasbourg Cathedral played an important role in the transfer of new forms from France to the empire. I pass now word to Peter.
The founding of the Corpus Vitriarum in 1952 sharpened awareness of the question of the state of preservation with regard to medieval stained glass. For a long time, this problem became even the central field of research. According to the guidelines to be followed by all authors of the corpus, it became the rule that the question of authenticity had to be clarified before considering dating, stylistic attribution, and interpretation of content. The recovery of many stained glass windows during the war offered art historians the opportunity to examine the material substance of the works at close quarters. Much of what was previously thought to be medieval turned out to be the product of a later period. With regard to Strasbourg, Kunze had already addressed this problem in an essay from 1912. but only the corpus authors brought the fragmentary preservation of the stained glass with the royal images and the multiple shifts within the side aisle windows to the attention of art historians. The publication of the corpus volume in 1986 thus marked a milestone, not only from an art historical perspective, but also in terms of knowledge about the authenticity of the stained glass windows. Christiane Wildblock, who examined the stained glass windows in the northern aisles for the corpus volume, also considered the question of the iconography and meaning of the royal images, which had not been addressed in detail since the EO's essay published in 1907. For the EO, it was clear that the images of the German kings and emperors were intended as a political statement from the time after Conradin's execution in 1268. No, yes, 68. The EO, however, did not mention the halos of the monarchs with a single word. Christiane Wildblock referred to the kings and emperors as just judges and vicars of Christ on earth, with reference to the halos. The corpus author placed the Strasbourg series of royal images in the tradition of the galleries of kings on the facades of French cathedrals, a comparison that had already been hinted at by the EO and emphasized by Grodecki, who postulated the nave glazing of Saint-Remy in Reims as a model for the Strasbourg series. But apart from the fact that the kings in Saint-Remy are depicted sitting on thrones and not standing, Madeleine Caviness is undoubtedly right to consider the Saint-Remy stained glass to be younger than the Romanesque group of Strasbourg Cathedral series of royal images. In connection with the Strasbourg kings and emperors, Wildblock refers to the coronation ceremony during which the future king made a promise to protect the church. In our opinion, the series of kings cannot be explained with reference to the politics of the day, but must be interpreted as part of ecclesia. The monarchs not only the protectors of church, but also keep the peace that is necessary for the clergy to fulfill its mission of salvation. The concepteur of the iconographic program used the list of kings and emperors in a manuscript as a model for the series of kings. The historian Dieter Mertens postulated that this manuscript was in the possession of the cathedral chapter. The hitherto unsolved problem is the stained glass window with the adoration of the Magi, which was located in the window adjoining St. Lawrence's Chapel before 1877. All authors have considered this stained glass window from around 1330 to be a work that was not created for this place, and therefore did not seem to have any reference to the emperors and kings. Most researchers located the original site of this work in the Clear Story, where it was supposedly reinserted in the 14th century. It was not until Rüdiger Bexmann pointed out that the dimensions of the individual panels were much too small for this site, and that the stained glass was therefore intended from the outset for an ale window. He saw the combination of a series of royal images with the adoration of the Magi as an idea that originated in the glazing of Cologne Cathedral choir, consecrated in 1322. There, the Epiphany image is flanked on both sides along the entire length of the choir by a series of unnamed crowned figures, each holding the ruler's insignia of scepter and orb, as in Strasbourg. two central questions about the Strasbourg emperors and kings have remained unresolved. Firstly, the significance of a series of monarchs in stained glass as part of religious architecture, and secondly, the convincing explanation for their combination with the adoration of the Magi in the first half of the 14th century. Can you still understand me? My voice is most authors who tried to interpret a series of kings saw the royal images as an intrusion of the secular into the sacred space. Christian Bloch has challenged this interpretation with reference to the presence of the heralds, which I have supported in an essay published in 1997. In fact, the presence of the series of royal images can only be understood as part of the overall ecclesiological program of Strasbourg Cathedral's glazing. The argument made by Daniel Paredo in 2011 that only the insertion of the adoration of the Magi in one of the north end windows around 1330 transformed the secular imagery into a Christian one is completely misguided. The reason for the change of the program was the Marian pilgrimage that the Strasbourg clergy had been trying to establish since the beginning of the construction of the West Facade in order to generate the necessary income to fund the ambitious building program. However, our joint research, which will be published this year, will demonstrate that the explanation lies in the series of royal images itself. The program of Cologne Cathedral's choir glazing was completed in 1322 when Heinrich von Firneburg, a determined supporter of the so-called Cologne coronation theory, was Archbishop of the Rhineland. According to this theory, only the Archbishop of Cologne could be the coronator of the German king, since Aachen, the place of coronation, was on the territory of one of his suffragan dioceses, namely Liège. In Cologne, the adoration of the Magi forms depending on the direction in which the viewer walks through the cathedral choir, the climax, or the origin of the series of royal images. It is known that many Roman German kings, freshly crowned, made their first pilgrimage to Cologne to venerate the Magi lying in the shrine in the cathedral's axial chapel. Moreover, art historical research has so far overlooked the fact that since the coronation of Henry VII of Luxembourg in 1308, the festive mass in Aachen was celebrated according to the formula of Epiphany. At this time, the Strasbourg canons considered it obviously no longer sufficient to distinguish the rulers of the empire with a halo as sanctified members of a comprehensive image program of Strasbourg Cathedral's glazing. Now, the members of the chapter wanted them to be presented as named individuals in the succession of the Magi, who were the first to recognize the kingship of Christ. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for a really fascinating paper, for two fascinating papers, in fact, that really address relationships between glass and architecture. We have now a little bit of time for questions. So I'd invite Alexandra to, as it were, join the floor. And I have some questions in the chat and from other sources. So I might ask Alexandra first, a question from Joseph Chandler Williams, who writes, I appreciate your synthetic discussion of so storied a problem in Gothic history. PK's point about the theatrical, i.e. liturgical function of certain design choices is well taken, but it is perhaps worth emphasizing that the intertwining of liturgical and iconographical meaning. So worth emphasizing that intertwining. Sujet refers to Chevet of Saint-Denis as Mount Zion, and such topographical symbolism of parts of medieval liturgical space draws on conventions going back to the St. Gall plan. Is this not iconographical at the same time as it is liturgical?
That's a very, very good question. And of course, it would be silly to try to separate these things in the minds of a patron like Sujet, where there would just have been a oneness. I think it is worth to try to separate them, however, when we can to try, or I think it's worth, Paul and Piquet have shown us that it's worth trying to separate them when we come to think of the influence that patrons had on architecture. Abstract ideas like Mount Zion were very difficult to put into any kind of architectural practice, whereas liturgy in the broader sense is about function. And this means I need a door here, I need to pass here, my procession goes there. So I think in that sense, it makes sense to separate these ideas, but not, of course, for Sujet.
Thank you. And then I have a question for Peter Kuhlman, Brigitte, Kuhlman, Schwartz from Alex Bovey. I should first of all say just thank you for your paper. And what I found so interesting about it is the connections with Leon Cathedral in Spain and the glass there, where you have similar images of the king as emperor in precisely the moment that Alfonso X has pretensions to be Holy Roman Emperor. But this question comes from Alex Bovey, who asks about, in some ways in connection with Alexandre's paper, the connections between the glass and the experience of visitors to Strasbourg Cathedral. Is there a way to connect the images of kings with a kind of a ductus of visitors to the cathedral, either via the liturgy or other kinds of uses of the space?
That's a difficult question.
Very good one, but difficult one.
Yes. It depends which visitor it was, in which time, because first, as we said, all the windows of the northern aisle were filled with these figures, and there was a change in 30, around, one thinks about around 1330, 1320, 1330. And I cannot say if there was if for Strasbourg, we haven't any reference in written sources how one used this northern aisle and what went on in this liturgically in this part of the building. So it's different. One tried to explain the existence of this row of monarchs by the fact that Henry II founded in a stall in the choir for the emperor, and one thought that this highly aristocratic chapter wanted to remember this fact, but for me it's always a little not a very convincing explanation. It can be, but
thank you. James Hall notes as well in the chat that the Byzantine emperor and imperial family were depicted with halos, and he asked, could there be a connection?
That's possible because Bishop Werner was in southern Italy as with embassy of the emperor, but the problem is that the Romanesque kings and emperors were only created around 1180, when after a fire in Strasbourg Cathedral, and then the chapter decided to reconstruct the choir, and during this time they used the nave as their choir, and they had to have new glass because they couldn't celebrate in a in a room which is open to all the wind and the weather. So,
may I add a reflection, please? We have no idea, of course, of the program, of the iconographic program of the windows of Werner's cathedral. It could be that there was already a program of kings in around 1000. This is not excluded because Becksmann and others have made sure that in Rhenish cathedrals, above all in Speyer, there was a huge program of stained glass. Of the date we don't know, but there was it until the 16th century. So it could be that from the beginning of Werner's cathedral, of the building of Werner's cathedral, there was a program which was repeated at the end of the 12th century and repeated again after the middle of the 13th century and rearranged again in the 1330s. And finally in the modern times after the Middle Ages. This is not impossible. So we would have a transformation of always the same program during several centuries. Well, but this is all highly hypothetical, I admit. I mean, the first step is hypothetical. The other steps, as we have shown, I think, are materially assured.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There are a number of comments in the chat. Some of them might be of interest to the speakers, but without necessarily requiring an answer. But perhaps I'll take a question for Alexandra from Kelly Anderson, who asked, did the easternmost gold crucifix predate Suger? And is there any evidence that if it did, that he chose to leave it in its place and build around it?
No, so the cross I was talking about, the cross that was, there were several crosses at Saint-Denis, of course, but the cross I was talking about that was standing just west of the shrine altar was made by Suger. He made it with the gems he bought cheaply from the Cistercians. And I'm not quite sure what is meant by build around. It was standing there probably, if I can remember now off the cuff, until the early 16th century when it was moved to the root screen. 1611, I think, to the root screen, early 17th century.
Thank you. There's a question here or a comment, but it's a kind of a rather big one. I don't know if anyone wants to tackle it, but from Mark Quinson, who notes that to non-medievalists, Panofsky's Gothic architecture and scholasticism remains an intellectual monument, an important tool to think with, regardless of whether Panofsky got Suger right or not. That's why we still read him. What happened to that ambition to say something relevant for cultural historians more generally among medieval art historians since Panofsky? I dare say that some people might not agree with the premise of that question. I don't know if anyone would like to address that directly. If not, it's something we can perhaps ruminate on more generally.
Well, I think the question that Panofsky is still relevant is proved by the fact that we've been talking about him so much today. If he wasn't at all relevant, we wouldn't. And Betsy's project, certainly we all use Panofsky's translation of Suger into English. The second part of the question is more difficult to respond to. But I think, well, thinking about, this brings me back to Paul and PK, of course. I think they very much had both, I think I'm right, the ambition to say something culturally relevant for historians more generally, and I think they did.
Excellent. Thank you, Alexandre, and thank you to Brigitte and Peter. We have our next session starting at 5:30. So I think we will take a break now, a moment to stand up and look away from screens. So we will meet again very shortly before 5:30, and we thank our speakers once again. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, on a sunny London afternoon. We come now to our final session of the afternoon, and it's my pleasure to introduce Eric Fernie, who's Professor Emeritus at the Courtauld Institute and was, in fact, editor, along with Paul Crossley, of a collection of essays in honour of Peter Kidson, Medieval Architecture and its Intellectual Context, not to mention author of numerous other publications. Eric's paper today concerned the study of medieval architectural proportions in the 20th century, and I hand over to him now.
Thanks, Tom. When I was a student at the Courtauld in the early 1960s, I thoroughly enjoyed Peter Kidson's classes. So much did I enjoy them that basically they laid out the research pattern, the things I was going to be working on from then on. And also from some time afterwards, he and I became very good friends. When Paul was in Manchester, we got to know one another through the normal circuit of, lectures and conferences and that sort of thing. And we soon found that we shared admiration for Peter. And we got together, and as Tom mentioned, that meant that we produced Festschrift for Peter. And all I can say is that it was a real joy working with Paul on something to offer an encomium to Peter. I also want to quote from the concluding paragraph of a memoir of the life of Christopher Holer, written by one of his colleagues at the Courtauld after his death in 1997. Quote, "The one piece missing from the foregoing tale is an explanation of the profound impression that Holer made on his students. He made no attempt to mold them in his own image, and none resembled him at all closely. But in their various ways, they were all affected by exposure to the sheer brilliance of a powerful mind incapable of concealing highly charged feelings about the past. If I am right in my belief that Holer tried to understand the way art functioned in medieval society from strictly medieval points of view, they picked up the message, and so began the slow reorientation of fundamental attitudes needed to reunite art history with the mainstream. When Paul followed a trail of pious foundations across Central Europe and saw that they were linked by the patronage of the noble house of Andechs-Meran, or detected the meaning behind the distribution of altars in a Nuremberg church, he was on a direct line from Holer," unquote. The author of the memoir was Peter Kidson, and the Paul mentioned is, of course, Paul Crossley. So the passage involves three of the people who were most influential in forming the study of the Middle Ages at the Courtauld in the second half of the 20th century. It could only be more complete if it had mentioned George Janetsky, who played such a central role in medieval scholarship at the Institute, and who, of course, was responsible for Paul's close association with Poland. My paper is dedicated with gratitude and admiration to Peter and to Paul, but given the nature of its subject, it is Peter who is central to what follows. And so to architectural proportions. I have identified 5 contentious claims where I support those who disagree with them. They fall into 2 categories: claims to do with the history of proportions and claims about the methods used to study them. I'll begin with the claim that units of measure were not used in the designing of medieval buildings. Here, for example, is Francois Boucher, 1972. Linear measurements are, for all practical purposes, non-existent in medieval architecture. And there are scholars who do accept that units were used, but not in conjunction with geometry. For example, Norbert Stachura, 2004. They used units in designing the St. Gall plan, therefore the use of geometry is unlikely. The contrary, and in my view correct opinion, is that they did use linear measures and that they used them together with geometry. In support, I note first, really just one thing, Abbot Suger, in his De Consecratione Ecclesiae Sancti Dionysii, where he says that his masons used instrumentis geometricis et arithmetricis. That proves that units were used in the designing of buildings, or at least one building, but that of the highest status, and obviously with masons to match. It is possible that they weren't used with the geometry, but a straightforward reading of that statement suggests that they were. In addition to Suger's evidence, there are those dozens of examples of the use of units and geometry together proposed in Peter's thesis of 1956. Here are some of the buildings he analyzes in terms of units and geometry. The Artemision at Ephesus, the Parthenon, the Pantheon, the Basilica of Maxentius, Old St. Peter's, Hagia Sophia, St. Michael's at Hildesheim, and the cathedrals of Durham, Sens, Laon, Paris, Bourges, Chartres, Reims, and Amiens. That's the first claim. The next claim is that because those who designed buildings in the second half of the first millennium did not have access to the writings of antiquity on planning, they could not have used the irrational proportions, that is chiefly the golden section and the square root of 2. The statement concerning the writings is correct. Discussions of geometry and planning common in antiquity, from Plato to the Agrimensores, including the irrational proportions, do fall out of the literature in the second half of the first millennium. The relevant texts from antiquity were translated into Arabic by Arab scholars in the 8th and 9th centuries, and then those were translated into Latin by Western scholars from the late 10th century on, making them accessible again. Hence the conclusion that Masons could not have used the irrationals in the intervening centuries. This view is supported by the golden section being very difficult to grasp, as here. Now let me see, I need to go to there. This is a representation of the golden section. And what you are looking at is that the line A to B relates to in proportion to BC in the same way as BC relates to AC. Now, I don't know about you, but I find it almost impossible. No, I find it impossible to know where to put that B. It's simply something that has to be produced by an alternative route. And I find the same when I put it in terms of numbers. Here, for example, in feet or inches or whatever, now you can do the arithmetic, but setting it up, this is an extremely difficult exercise. So that supports the view that the architects and masons in that period might well not have used the golden section anyway. Well, my response is as follows. Some masons did read texts, that's certainly true, but there is no reason to believe that this was a common feature of being a Mason. They were therefore not dependent on the texts for their techniques. As Peter says in his thesis, they used those techniques because they worked in a tradition. Also, while the golden section is conceptually complex, physically laying it out is as easy as falling off a log as here. Now, I hope my face is not getting in the way of that. As you can see, what we're getting here is draw a square, divide it in half, draw the diagonal of a half, and swing it down. The side of the square is to the new length as the proportion of the golden section, all of which can be accomplished with nothing more than pegs and ropes. And here it is on the plan, and again getting my thing out of the way. Here it is on the plan of the nave of the small, unpretentious 11th century church at Chithurst in Sussex. In the case of the square root of 2, the side to diagonal irrational proportion, it is, of course, straightforward to conceive, but Vitruvius gave it such an astronomically high reputation that it would be no surprise if it became part of architectural thinking and hence of the toolkit of any Mason, especially as it was associated with the stability of the world. Right, the third and final claim concerning history is that they did not use drawings, that is, plans and elevations, before the 13th century. It is a fact that the earliest plans and elevations are of that century. The absence of a plan and elevation would mean that the continuity of the designing Mason was very important, as he would have had the plan in his head. Right, here's my response to the claim. The idea that you could keep the design of a building such as a huge cathedral in your head, I shouldn't say huge, I should say complex cathedral, in your head is difficult to accept, but I suppose it is possible. But even if you can persuade yourself that the master mason could do this and communicate his design to the people who were working for him, the people under him, what about in the other direction, the patrons? How did a patron know what they were signing up to, what they were paying for and associating themselves with, if they only had an architect's description? This could work for a design similar to other buildings, but what about innovative ones? The explanation for there being no plans before the 13th century is much simpler, and it has nothing to do with designing buildings. It is that the 12th century saw a revolution in record keeping. William the Conqueror's doomsday was an early indication in the 1080s, and by the 13th century, much more material was simply being kept on file, including copies of the plans of buildings. Before the 13th century, the plans, without being copied, would have been used in construction, consequently becoming worn out and damaged, and hence discarded. Turning from disagreements about the techniques used to design buildings to the methods that scholars use to investigate them, I have two subjects. First is whether one can get trustworthy answers from drawing lines on plans, or whether it is necessary to use measurements. Here I am once again, surprise, surprise, on the side of Peter. Drawing lines on plans is no use at all. You have to use measurements, see the multiple examples in the thesis, because if you draw diagrams onto a plan, then the margins of error are just too great. Take the example on the screen. That pattern could have been derived from the drawing of the plan, which has been published in many places, but that wouldn't have been trustworthy. And in fact, I used the dimensions, having measured the building, to establish it. I would make one exception to the rejection of drawing patterns on plans, namely the work of Robert Bork, as in his Geometry of Creation, 2011, as he conducts his experiments on 13th and 14th century drawings. He is therefore working at the size of the original, which makes all the difference needed. Right, now, the other subject on methods is the introduction of computing. This is obviously a very important development in the area. There are, however, aspects in one presentation which are worth commenting on. The article in question is a report on data analysis of building geometry by computer by Wolfgang Wiener and Gerhard Wetzel of 1994. They express the view that computer analysis is accurate because it is based on numbers. This, of course, agrees with the argument I have just put forward about the need to use measurements. But the article is very odd in what it says about research conducted before the introduction of computers. To quote, "The methodical approach to building geometry by data analysis has proved successful. One of its specific advantages is the exact documentation of data and their results. Since these are expressed by numbers, they can be checked and theories can be discussed rationally, whereas traditional graphical interpretations are highly subjective, segmental, and much more uncertain. Without control by measurements, such interpretations remain totally non-committal." Well, I would just say a little historiography is required there, including Peter's thesis and publications, which form a very respectable body of work based always on the evidence of the measurements. Also, here is another quote from Wiener and Wetzel. "Furthermore, data analysis, that is via computer, is the only way to detect patterns not directly represented in the form of the building." That sounds to me as if the computer knows more about the design than the architect did. In other words, one of the things to beware of in computer investigations of architectural design is the overproduction of results. Right now, having discussed those claims concerning history and methods, I am going to turn to Peter's work on the units of measure in themselves, that is, to the history of lengths, a part of metrology. I'm doing this in a different way from the preceding points, not debating whether something is correct or incorrect, or I agree with it or disagree with it, but providing a taste of something that absolutely fascinated Peter in order to illustrate an aspect of his mind. The examples are from his thesis, almost all of them, but also from the 1990 article, presented by periods and countries and in broadly chronological order. So, starting with the Romans. On the Roman foot, the range of the accepted lengths runs from 29.5 to 29.8 centimeters, with 29.57 being the most accurate and approved length. Peter nevertheless argues that feet of 29.6 and 29.77 centimeters, despite being within the range of examples of the standard foot, are different units from it. I've got a, yes, so you've got the Roman foot with its range, and then the other units, which Peter argues belong to different feet. He also uses the Roman foot, talking about those different feet, to establish other lengths from antiquity, such as the Caucasian, the Ibutian, the Caponian, and Drusian feet. By the way, I should mention that I have changed how Peter presents the dimensions. He gives them in meters, so that 29.77 centimeters is 0.2977 of a meter, as you can see what I've added there. Now, I don't know about you, I have done this because I find 0.2977 of a meter much more difficult to grasp than 29.77 centimeters, which I read as 29 units and approximately three quarters of a unit. But I'm sure Peter would have disapproved of what I've done here. Right, on to the medieval. Peter suggests that the Roman pes filetarius of 35.5 centimeters could have been the basis for the medieval pes manualis of 32.6 centimeters, as 13 inches of the manualis equal 35.3 centimeters. And there you have it, the figures on the screen. He also says that the important change in the post-antique period is from the pes and decempeda to the palmo and canna. This happens via the passetto, which is not found in the ancient system, but which is very like 2 pedes drusiani and 3 dodrans. In Italy, now in the Middle Ages, as I say, one of the chief measures was the 47 centimeter foot of Liutprand, the Lombard king in the early 8th century. Calci in the 15th century reasonably took 47 centimeters length as a cubit, a foot and a half, the foot of which would be 31.3 centimeters. Or it could be based on the king's actual foot. That sounds completely unreasonable. Half as long again as the average human foot, but the proof is there in the image on his tomb in Pavia. In the German Empire, the Rhenish foot was 31.82 centimeters long. Guillermoth in 1913 explained it by proposing that it is 16/15 of the Roman foot. Let me give you that. Peter rejects this because dividing anything into 15 parts, he says, is a very impractical thing to do. Here are some examples from France, 2 examples anyway. In the area around Chartres, there are records of 3 perches or poles of 26 feet, 22 feet, and 21 feet 8 inches. Let me give you that there. Peter suggests that 21 foot 8 inches is so close to 22 feet that it must be a different unit. In other words, he's applying the same argument as he applied with those odd Roman feet. And he adds that a medieval history of Chartres says that the city used a foot of 13 inches and points out that 20 feet of 13 inches each will equal 21 feet 8 inches. The Roman writer Columella refers to the candatum and the arepanem, and Peter agrees with the view that the arepanem is the basis for the French arpent. The Chartres cartulary of 1226 says each arpent ought to contain 150 perches. So we are into farming dimensions. Then there is an ordinance of 1669, which has the arpent as 10 square perches, each of 22 feet. Peter notes that the French forest perch of 22 pieds d'oie was still in use in the time of Louis XIV, in the late 17th, early 18th century. The perche du roi was 7.146 meters, which is very near a Roman perch of 17 Roman feet, or 5.03 meters multiplied by √2. I'm again giving you Peter's argument. The Arpenum Regis, which was measured by this perch, is virtually identical with the Heradium. It equals 22 pieds du rat. I should say that equals 22 pieds du rat. And the Arpent was a square with 10 perches aside. A 1793 value of the pied gives the side of the Arpent as 71.46 meters, or 241.5 Roman feet. Well, if you think metrology is a bizarre, febrile subject, you are not alone. Here is Josephus, writing in the 1st century AD. Cain, he says, and I quote, increased his substance with the wealth amassed by rapine and violence. He incited to luxury and pillage all whom he met, and became their instructor in wicked practices. He put an end to that simplicity in which men had lived before, and he did this by the invention of weights and measures. The guileless and generous existence which they had enjoyed in ignorance of these things, he converted into a life of craftiness. And here is the Italian scholar Attilio Stazio in 1959 on the subject. La metrologia non è una scienza, è un incubo. Having heard the preceding examples, I think you might agree that it is indeed a demon. While Peter got into metrology because he needed it to investigate the buildings, a fair number of his comments in the thesis don't help to explain a building and are there just because he was interested. I mean, those Gothic cathedrals of the reign of Louis XIV, for example. It is a mark of Peter's status as a scholar that he confronted and mastered this demon over such a wide span of cultures and across whole millennia. Peter went where his curiosity took him, and then engaged with the challenges to the very highest standards of scholarly investigation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric, for one, exposing my own blissful ignorance or inability to deal with these things, but also for highlighting some of these still outstanding debates. We turn now to our second talk in this session, and just a reminder to everyone that there'll be time for discussion at the end of the second paper. So if you would like to ask any questions or make any observations, do please put those in the chat and we will raise them. But now it's my pleasure to introduce our final speaker for today, who is Sarah Pearson. Sarah is Peter Kidson's widow, as Debbie mentioned, and also an architectural historian. And in fact, I discovered only recently that she, for some years, was editor of the Journal of the British Archaeological Association, a role that I now fill. I'm especially delighted that she's been able to join us today, and she will speak to us about PK's unfinished but much anticipated book, From Greek Temples to Gothic Cathedrals, Studies of Architectural Design in Classical Antiquity and the Middle Ages. We've heard about it a little bit already from Eric, but we will hear much more now from Sarah. So over to you, Sarah.
For those who don't know me, I've been asked to start with a word about how I came to know Peter. And I should say I was a BA student at the Courtauld in the early 1960s, where I specialised in the Middle Ages. I then went to Berkeley and studied for a year with Jean Bonny. On my return to the Courtauld, I began a PhD on Romanesque and early Gothic churches in France. But before finishing it, I'm afraid I veered away from strict art history to spend my career working on English vernacular architecture. Although taught by Peter as a BA student, I only came to know him personally in the late 1960s when I became his partner. Hence, my task today is to tell you about the book he left unfinished at his death in 2019. Peter, or PK, as he was more familiarly known, was awarded his thesis entitled Systems of Measurement and Proportion Used in Early Medieval Architecture in 1956. But his examiners, Jean Bonny and Anthony Blunt, made plain they didn't think it was publishable without further work, a view with which he heartily concurred. Shortly after this, he became librarian of the Conway, the Courtauld's fast expanding photographic library for architecture and sculpture. And a lot of time was spent traveling with photographers, exploring and photographing buildings both in England and across Europe. He wrote 2 or 3 books on medieval architecture and on sculpture at Chartres, as well as articles on various English cathedrals. He also began lecturing at Courtauld and elsewhere, and his seminars were well known for being extensive affairs, lasting for far more than the allotted period, and often continuing in the pub around the corner once formal proceedings were over. While his interest in the subject of the thesis never waned, these years were spent on other writing, teaching, and generally expanding his knowledge in many directions. In 1980, he was invited to give the Mellon Lectures at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, and the obvious subject for a series of 6 talks was the theme of the thesis. This, he hoped, would be the stimulus required to pull a book together, particularly as publication was part of the deal. In the event, from his point of view, and maybe from that of the organisers, the lectures were what he considered a failure. In order to make the subject interesting, he included lots of slides of the medieval buildings he was talking about, since he thought that lectures on proportions and measurements were hardly likely to hold the interest of a large audience of the general public. However, he felt that the pictures distracted the audience and made it impossible for them to follow the argument and take the theme of measurements and proportions seriously. Thus, he discovered, too late, that the subject was totally ill-suited to public lecturing. Even more importantly, he was coming to see that in order to make his case convincing, he had to go back to the origins of the measures that medieval architects and masons used and prove that they were embedded in a tradition that extended backwards through the classical period into pre-classical times in the Middle East. Part of the problem was that while the values for the ratios could have been shown to have been known in Mesopotamia by 1750 BC, they were clearly also known in Egypt 1,000 years earlier, and no respectable mathematician believed that the Egyptians were first on the scene. Thus, he needed to find pre-documentary evidence in Mesopotamia. For an art historian whose main subject was the European Middle Ages, delving into a completely new period and an area that many academics considered was only inhabited by the lunatic fringe was a challenge which meant a huge amount of research on history, mathematics, metrology, architecture, and archaeology. The opportunity to give this enlarged challenge his undivided attention only came in 1990 when he retired, and this is what he did for the next 10 to 15 years. The book was largely written by 2005. Some of you may remember a party held in the Courtauld for his 80th birthday that year, when he declared the book to be finished. Up to a point it was, but he simply hadn't allowed for the amount of tedious work required to finalize footnotes and illustrations, to none of which he gave his full attention because he kept remodeling and revising what he'd written, something which continued until he had a severe stroke in 2015. Thus, the meat of the book was largely complete, but it cannot have been said to be ready for publication. Can I have the second slides, please?
Yep, they're on there now.
Good. This slide shows a brief outline of the contents. He divided the book into 2 volumes. In his own words, the first volume contains a brisk chapter on the way thinking about Gothic has evolved since the Renaissance, and the space it leaves for a systematic study of design techniques. The second chapter attempts to trace the contents of Masonic mathematics as documented at the end of the Middle Ages back to their presumed sources in Mesopotamian arithmetic. And the third shows the part played by the same mathematical substratum in the history of pre-metric metrology. This leaves the second volume to be free to be devoted exclusively to what was the primary purpose, or always the primary purpose of the whole exercise, namely a demonstration of the presence of a substantial mathematical constant in the design of religious buildings, from the earliest Greek Doric temples to the high Gothic cathedrals of medieval France. The fact that it contains material from several different disciplines made him fear that it would not be well received by any of them. And it was this feeling of trespassing on territory in which he couldn't claim academic expertise that probably underlay the inhibition to publish. It's certainly not a normal art historical work. It is also a work largely of the last part of the 20th century and takes little account of recent research. In his experience and judgment, very little new research would have altered the theme of what he was saying. Whether this still remains true, I'm in no position to say. But his own view was that even though there might well be criticism in detail, the main hypothesis would stand the test of time. At the end of the book, he summarized this hypothesis as follows: that the discovery of the mathematical enigma of incommensurability had a seminal impact on the thought world of remote antiquity, at first and for long afterwards as an esoteric religious revelation. That the first mathematical insights occurred in Mesopotamia, that the primary incommensurables became the conceptual matrix of the architectural ratios, which in practice functioned as pairs of integral numbers that approximate to the notional norms. That in Europe, the design code survived in more or less continuous use until the 16th century, and that the dominant systems of linear measures in antiquity and pre-metric Europe were intimately related to the design code. Over the last year, I've been trying to put the book in order. I'm not probably the best person to be doing this because, unlike Eric, I can't understand an awful lot of this. I come from a mathematical family and I'm missing the gene that actually allows me to understand maths in any way, shape or form. However, I'm trying. There is still some way to go, and even once I've done all I can, lacunae will remain, both in terms of a few areas of incomplete text, of some footnotes indicated but not completed, and figures which have not been finalized or systematically ordered or labeled. Despite these shortcomings, I believe the work still has value and is well worth making publicly accessible, although in exactly what format is not, I'm unsure. Some suggestions have already been made to me, but if anyone here has ideas about the best way to make an incomplete book of this kind easily available, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That takes us back so nicely to the first paper of today in thinking about these extraordinarily ambitious books, but that remained incomplete and unpublished, at least so far. So we have a little bit of time now for questions before we end the day. And I might start with a question for Eric from Nick Yazikov, who says, you mentioned that there is a risk inherent to the algorithmic and digital approaches you highlighted, an aura of full subjectivity and scientific precision. How can we best redirect these methods to generate productive research questions? You're muted at the moment.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Yes. What I said was, oh gosh, I'm in no position to answer that question at all, just like Sarah was saying earlier. All I'm saying is that you have got to be careful when you're using a computer that you don't get too many solutions or proposals as to the formulae that you find coming out of the machine. I wouldn't go beyond that.
Thank you. There's a kind of follow-up question then from Stephen Murray, which you may or may not feel qualified to answer, which is if you can comment on the potential role of laser scanning.
Again, no, I did this on purpose, talking about architectural proportions in the 20th century, because I can't claim to have kept up with these latest developments. I use them, I use what people publish about them, but I'm not in a position to comment.
Thank you, Eric. Well, I might ask a question then, which takes us back to the 20th century, and it's addressed to either Sarah or Eric, but which is to ask if you ever measured buildings with PK, and actually, in all the stories I ever heard about PK from Paul, which was many of them, I never heard about the kind of the process of measuring these things. And I wonder if either of you can just say something. Did it involve getting out a tape measure or pacing out these things? Susie Nash recounts a story of a Courtauld trip where, in order to make a point, Peter Kidson borrowed a ruler that she had in a filofax in order to measure something. But I'm interested in the tools that were used.
Well, Peter himself didn't measure buildings. I mean, he actually, and this is actually where he could only use certain buildings, or where he felt that the drawings that had the measurements that had been done were accurate. I mean, he was very dependent upon other people's extremely accurate drawings. And if there aren't such things, or if he thought they were dubious, then he wasn't going to, well, he might make comments, but he wasn't going to do the full works on it.
Well, as a specific example I can mention of that is Durham, because the drawings by Billings are, in 19th century, they are very accurate. And Peter made extensive use of them in his analysis of Durham Cathedral.
Thank you. And I might follow that with a question for Eric, but that comes out of something that Sarah mentioned, which is that these things, or the suggestion that these systems of measurement change from the 16th century onwards. And I wonder if you can, in some ways, both papers you've discussed the kind of long roots of these systems of measure. Could you say something about when they end, when those systems of proportions of measure end, and why that is? Does that come from just a different conception of how buildings are designed, or does it relate to new technologies and new instruments?
Well, I think the short answer I would give is the invention of the metric system.
But wasn't it actually really Alberti who put the lid on things by discovering Vitruvius? And Vitruvius gets a very short shrift from Peter as being very much somebody who was quite good at designing, I can't remember now, bridges and that sort of thing, but absolutely not much use at measuring, at designing buildings and so on. He never, as far as we know, worked on any good buildings at all.
Yes, I certainly think that Vitruvius shouldn't be seen in that light. I think his importance is the fact that his books were read throughout the Middle Ages, and that people then took notice of what he said, rather than his own expertise.
Yeah, but then Alberti sort of knocked everything on the head and said, all this medieval nonsense is ridiculous. And by that time, the Masons, I mean, this is Peter's argument, by that time, the Masons were didn't really know what they were doing. They were doing something that they had learnt by rote and by tradition. They didn't really know what they didn't understand what it was that they were that they knew.
Well, yes, you're right about Alberti's effect on their view of the Middle Ages. That's certainly true. Gothic architecture as a whole. But I think that a lot of these systems simply continued. I mean, you've got the English foot, for example, the English yard, and the perch, and so on and so forth. Those don't fall out of existence.
No, but they were used for all sorts of other things as well.
Yes.
And they weren't particularly used for architecture at a later date, were they?
I think they were used for architecture, and they were used for other things all the way through, as I mentioned, you know, the farming and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another question in the chat from Brigitte, who asked, was Peter finally able to find proof of systems of measurement that he was interested in that dated prior to the classical period?
I think that's
for me. I think what he felt was that there was just a huge accumulation of evidence which taken together suggests certain things. I don't think you can actually sort of prove in the sense of 2 and 2 equal 4 sort of thing.
Well, I'd add to that the piece of clay from Babylon, I think it's about 2600 BC, which has a representation of the side to diagonal proportion, the square root of 2, and a series of them which indicate that the people who made it understood this irrational proportion. So they were doing that 2,500 years into the BC period.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much to both our speakers. There is a few comments in the chat that people may want to look at, but I think no further questions beyond general thanks to our speakers in our last session and indeed throughout the day. So thank you to all of you, and I look forward to rejoining everyone from 2 o'clock UK time tomorrow.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.